Childhood in medieval Europe was not a sweet, golden age of innocence. No one looked at a child and thought, "How precious." They looked at a child and thought, "Ah, a small, untrained sinner with legs." To medieval adults, children weren't fragile blossoms waiting to grow. They were half-shaped adults carrying the potential for chaos in every sticky-fingered gesture. Modern parents worry about screen time. Medieval parents worried about whether their child's soul came pre-dented. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Medieval Europe inherited a worldview shaped by theology, superstition, and the daily struggle of living through a time when your lifespan could be politely described as optimistic. Life was hard, unpredictable, and short, so children were expected to start learning how to survive as quickly as possible. Childhood wasn't a protected stage. It was a time-sensitive opportunity to hammer the moral dents out of a small human before society had to deal with the consequences. And because this worldview framed children not as innocent but as unfinished, medieval parents treated them like raw material needing significant intervention. A child wasn't seen as naturally curious. They were seen as naturally chaotic, prone to disobedience, and spiritually wobbly. Think of a toddler knocking over a cup of milk. Today, accidents happen. Medieval parents, the devil is testing us through you. A child who giggled too loudly, ran too fast, knocked things over, or showed too much emotion wasn't being childish. They were showing signs of instability that needed immediate correction. Adults believed that if you didn't fix these behaviors early, you'd end up with an adult who couldn't function, couldn't obey, and worst of all, couldn't contribute to the family's survival. And if there was one thing medieval Europe did not have time for, it was adults who struggled with anything other than labor, obedience, or prayer. To modern eyes, this all sounds extreme, but keep in mind, medieval life was a series of non-stop survival puzzles. You needed to know when to stay silent, when to obey, when not to touch the fire, when to avoid insulting the wrong person because the wrong person might own a sword. Medieval adults weren't trying to crush childhood, they were trying to prevent the long-term consequences of unprepared adulthood. The expectations for behavior reflected this. Children were required to show self-control from astonishingly young ages. The goal wasn't joy or emotional development, it was discipline and predictability. A child who acted like a child was considered dangerous, not adorable. When an adult saw a child running around wildly, they didn't see play, they saw a future liability with legs. Even the concept of innocence didn't exist in the way we understand it. A child wasn't assumed to be good, nor were they assumed to be misbehaving due to immaturity. Instead, their missteps were interpreted as moral or spiritual failings, tiny red flags indicating the need for immediate correction. Adults believed that a child's will was something that had to be bent early because if you waited until they were older, it might never bend at all. This led to an environment where children were monitored constantly, not gently, not subtly openly. Adults watched them the way modern security cameras watch convenience stores. Every action was interpreted as a sign of inner character. A child who obeyed promptly was a good child, one who might someday be trustworthy. A child who questioned things was seen as a warning sign of future rebellion. A child who sulked, emotional instability. A child who expressed too much joy, emotional instability. A child who simply existed in the wrong place at the wrong time, suspicious. Parents weren't trying to be cruel, they genuinely believed that strict discipline was the only way to shape a child properly. A medieval child wasn't thought of as a blank slate. They were thought of as a flawed slate with factory defects, and the adults were the repair technicians. Because of this, parenting wasn't affectionate the way we picture today. It was instructional, corrective, and deeply serious. Medieval parents didn't see themselves as caretakers of childhood. They saw themselves as responsible for producing competent adults as rapidly as possible. Children weren't told, "Be yourself." They were told, "Be a functioning human," immediately. There was almost no emotional cushioning. Life was hard, work was constant, disease was everywhere, and children were expected to toughen up fast because the world didn't slow down for anyone, least of all for someone under 4 feet tall. Medieval adults genuinely believed they were doing what was necessary, shaping children into resilient adults capable of surviving a world full of famine, warfare, and unpredictable disasters. And this is why a medieval child couldn't rely on the benefit of the doubt. If they did something wrong, the assumption wasn't they didn't know better. The assumption was they did know better, but chose not to. Children weren't seen as lacking understanding, they were seen as lacking discipline. There's a reason the medieval version of "they're just kids" was essentially "fix this before it becomes a problem." So yes, the good news was that you were young. But the bad news? In medieval Europe, being young meant you were a walking bundle of flaws adults were duty-bound to correct. Childhood wasn't a warm, whimsical phase, it was a countdown clock, and everyone was watching to see how fast you could grow up. To understand medieval discipline, you must first understand the medieval worldview, a universe where everything that went wrong wasn't an accident but a spiritual malfunction. This included children, especially children. In medieval Europe, childhood wasn't simply a biological stage. It was a theological crisis. Kids were seen as adorable bundles of inherited sin, toddling reminders that humanity had messed up in Eden and was still paying the bill. The concept of original sin shaped every part of medieval life, but nowhere did it hit harder than in how adults viewed children. From the moment a child was born, they were believed to carry the stain of Adam and Eve's cosmic mistake. In other words, the medieval baby didn't arrive innocent, they arrived guilty. Not legally, but spiritually. And in the eyes of medieval adults, that guilt required vigilant management. This belief turned discipline into a spiritual mission. When a child disobeyed, it wasn't interpreted as curiosity or impulse, it was proof of sin emerging, like weeds pushing through soil. Every tantrum, every act of resistance, every mistake was viewed as the sinful nature bubbling up and needing correction before it became permanent. Children weren't misbehaving, they were revealing the dire state of their souls. And since original sin was believed to cling stubbornly to human nature, adults thought discipline had to be equally stubborn. The goal wasn't to punish a child for a crime. It was to rescue them from their own moral decay. Medieval discipline often carried an air of religious urgency, a sort of act now before this becomes eternal mindset. Parents weren't just raising kids, they were attempting spiritual damage control. Enter the beating stick. It sounds harsh, and it was, but to medieval parents, the beating stick wasn't just a tool of correction. It was a moral instrument, a spiritual wrench used to tighten loose bolts in a child's character. Its purpose wasn't cruelty, but course correction. If modern parents rely on timeouts and conversations, medieval parents relied on the idea that physical correction pushed spiritual development in the right direction. Many adults believed they were fulfilling a divine responsibility. The frequently cited biblical phrase, "spare the rod, spoil the child," wasn't a metaphor, it was a job description. The rod was simultaneously symbolic and very literal. A parent who avoided physical punishment wasn't seen as gentle. They were seen as negligent, almost spiritually reckless. They were letting sin run wild, and that was unacceptable in a world where moral discipline was considered essential for salvation. There was also a deep fear that failing to discipline early would lead to moral ruin later. Medieval writings warned parents that undisciplined children would grow into adults who couldn't obey the church, couldn't follow the law, and worst of all, couldn't keep their own souls in order. A child wasn't a free spirit. They were a future adult whose salvation depended on early intervention. This spiritual responsibility extended beyond the household. Priests preached about correcting children. Church manuals advised on how to keep children on the path. Medieval villagers whispered about children who were too wild, interpreting it as a sign of spiritual danger. Even neighbours felt entitled to comment on how someone else's child was being raised, because discipline wasn't merely a family matter, it was a community matter. A badly disciplined child wasn't a nuisance. They were a walking theological hazard. The idea that suffering shaped moral character was deeply rooted in medieval thought. Adults believed that discipline, especially physical discipline, helped purify sinful tendencies. If a child cried after being punished, it was often seen not as a sign of harm, but as a sign that the lesson was working. Their discomfort was framed as spiritual progress. the soul's resistance giving way under the pressure of righteousness. Children, of course, didn't see it this way, but their perspective wasn't the one that mattered. Medieval society didn't center childhood emotions or development. It centered obedience, morality, and the belief that children were always one bad choice away from divine disappointment. This doesn't mean medieval parents were heartless. On the contrary, many believed physical correction was an act of love. It was the medieval equivalent of, "This hurts me more than it hurts you." Except medieval parents actually meant it. If they didn't intervene, they feared their child's soul would suffer consequences far worse than a sting from a stick. In that sense, discipline was less about punishment and more about prevention. It was intended to steer a child toward a good life, good meaning, obedient, morally aligned, and spiritually manageable. Medieval adults saw themselves as gatekeepers of their children's morality, standing guard against the lurking influence of original sin. When you put all this together, you get a world where the beating stick was not a reaction to misbehavior, but a preemptive tool. The child wasn't corrected because they broke a rule, they were corrected because adults believed they were born capable of breaking every rule. Whether a child fidgeted, hesitated, or simply looked like they were considering ignoring an instruction that was enough cause for intervention, sin never slept, so neither could discipline. In the medieval mind, a child wasn't learning right from wrong, they were being wrestled away from wrong so that right had a fighting chance. Parents weren't tyrants for the sake of authority, they were soldiers in a spiritual battle happening inside every child. To them, the beating stick wasn't the enemy, it was the ally. And that's why, in medieval Europe, you weren't naughty. You were pre-corrupted, born into a cosmic moral mess. Adults believed they were responsible for cleaning up, one painful lesson at a time. In medieval Europe, discipline wasn't just a household rule, it was a sacred duty endorsed by scripture, preached by clergy, and reinforced by nearly every authority figure a child could possibly encounter. To medieval adults, corporal punishment wasn't merely acceptable, it was a moral obligation. A parent who didn't discipline with force wasn't just being lenient, people viewed them as neglecting their child's spiritual health. The rod wasn't optional, it was divine parenting equipment. The medieval mind saw the world in a hierarchy centered around obedience to God, to the church, to lords, to guild masters, to fathers, to teachers. This meant children were expected to absorb obedience early and thoroughly. Corporal punishment was the method of choice because it was believed to produce two essential virtues, fear and humility. Fear kept you from doing wrong. Humility kept you from questioning authority. And if those two virtues could be instilled before a child turned 7, excellent. That was the ideal. Biblical passages were quoted constantly to justify this approach. Verses from Proverbs, "He who spares the rod hates his son," were interpreted with cheerful literalness. The word rod was not treated metaphorically. It was treated with the same practicality as a spoon or a broom. Clergymen preached from pulpits that physical punishment was an act of love, a way for parents to keep their children on a righteous path. In medieval sermons, the message was clear. A bruised backside was better than a ruined soul. And because religion held enormous power, these ideas weren't suggested, they were mandated. Parents who refrained from corporal punishment were often judged harshly. Rumours might circulate. Their child is too spirited. They don't correct him enough. That girl will be trouble when she's grown. Discipline wasn't private. It was everyone's business. Because everyone believed misbehaviour reflected not only on the child but on the entire household. The core belief was simple. Physical correction shaped character. It built discipline, trained moral instincts, and strengthened the will the same way a blacksmith hammered iron into a blade. Pain wasn't viewed as damaging. It was viewed as transformative. It was the price of becoming a morally upright person. This mindset meant that corporal punishment wasn't reserved for major offences. It was used for minor errors, preemptive warnings, and sometimes for no specific reason other than regular maintenance. A child who hesitated before responding to an instruction could be corrected. A child who handled a chore carelessly could be corrected. A child who showed excessive enthusiasm corrected. The goal wasn't merely obedience, it was conditioning. And because medieval households were often loud, chaotic, crowded spaces filled with labour, livestock smells, chores, and unpredictable stressors, children were expected to adapt instantly to adult expectations. A child couldn't disrupt the rhythm of work. They needed to fall in line fast, and corporal punishment was the quickest way to guarantee that. Importantly, the medieval understanding of affection differed from our modern version. Parents did love their children, but the medieval definition of love was rooted in duty more than emotional expression. You showed love by providing food, shelter, spiritual instruction, and correction. A parent who let their child run free was viewed not as compassionate, but irresponsible. The parent wasn't protecting their child from pain, they were exposing them to future sin, shame, or social ruin. In this context, corporal punishment took on an almost therapeutic quality. Adults believed a sharp sting could realign moral fibers the way a healer might reset a bone. Medieval writings frequently compared correction to pruning a tree. Cut away what is wild so the tree grows straight. Pain was the pruning knife. The straight result was a disciplined, obedient future adult. Children understood this logic well enough. Medieval children lived in a world where questioning discipline wasn't an option, and resisting it only invited more of it. Shame was a tool, fear was a tool, and the rod was a tool. Together, they produced the medieval version of well-behaved childhood, quiet, controlled, and constantly aware of the consequences of stepping out of line. This doesn't mean every family was unbearably harsh. There were variations depending on personality, region, and temperament. But across Europe, the idea that corporal punishment was morally good was nearly universal. Stories, sermons, and even medieval artwork reinforced this view. Tales of saints, cautionary fables, and moral instruction texts all used fear of punishment to model ideal behavior. Children's literature, what little existed, focused on obedience rather than joy. There were no whimsical stories about imagination or childhood adventure. Instead, tales warned children what happened to those who disobeyed. Spoiler, it was never good. The moral of every story was consistent. Obedience was safe, disobedience was dangerous, and would be immediately corrected. Teachers, too, leaned heavily on corporal punishment. Schools in the medieval period operated on the fundamental rule that pain equaled memory. If a child forgot a lesson, mispronounced a word, or failed to recite a passage correctly, the correction was swift. Medieval educational theory could be summarized as, "You'll learn it one way or another." All of this reinforced a worldview where corporal punishment wasn't an act of anger, but an act of structure. It was woven into the social fabric. The rod was less a symbol of authority and more an extension of it, like a medieval parenting manual carved in wood. To medieval adults, love wasn't gentle. Love wasn't soft. Love wasn't measured in hugs. Love hurt, on purpose, because in their eyes, pain didn't damage a child, pain shaped them. And a well-shaped child was the only kind that stood a chance of surviving adulthood in medieval Europe. In medieval Europe, a child's first steps weren't just a milestone, they were a transition into responsibility. Today, when a toddler takes their first wobbly step, adults clap, squeal, and record the moment on 17 different devices. In the medieval world, the reaction was more along the lines of, "Excellent, the tiny human is now mobile. Time to make sure they don't become a menace." Walking didn't make you adorable. It made you accountable. To medieval adults, mobility meant opportunity, which meant danger. A crawling baby could get into trouble, but a walking toddler could get into sin. They could wander where they shouldn't, touch what they shouldn't, imitate adults they shouldn't, and basically act like every toddler who has ever lived. Unpredictable agents of chaos, with no understanding of consequences. But in medieval Europe, unpredictable behavior wasn't considered normal. It was considered the early signs of a future disobedient adult. The medieval approach treated behavior in toddlers not as developmental stages, but as moral indicators. A toddler who grabbed things impulsively wasn't learning about the world, they were showing the first hints of stubbornness. A toddler who refused to stay still wasn't full of energy, they were displaying a rebellious spirit. A toddler who threw a tantrum wasn't overwhelmed, they were publicly announcing their inner moral instability. Everything a toddler did was interpreted as a statement about their future personality, and that meant early correction was essential. Because toddlers were seen as malleable, Medieval adults believed this was the best time to shape them. Today, we call this early childhood development. Medieval people called it avoiding long-term disaster. A toddler who learned obedience early would supposedly become a well-behaved, hard-working, God-fearing adult. A toddler who was allowed to act freely would supposedly become a nightmare, unfit for work, incapable of respecting authority, and perhaps worst of all, someone who caused trouble for the entire household. This meant that discipline began astonishingly young. The moment a child could walk, they were expected to follow instructions, stay where they were told, handle small chores without protest, and behave in a manner that did not inconvenience adults. You didn't get toddler years, you got toddler duties. One of the first lessons toddlers learned was control of their bodies. If a toddler slapped at a parent or threw food that wasn't seen as natural developmental behavior, it was seen as defiance that needed to be shut down quickly. Medieval adults believed that failing to correct such behavior immediately would allow it to grow into chronic disobedience. And since medieval life required constant cooperation, fetching water, tending fires, staying close to home, nothing was more dangerous than a child who believed they could act without consequences. Toddlers were also expected to understand the basics of respecting social hierarchy before they could string a full sentence together. They learned that adults outranked them, older children outranked them, and they outranked nobody. Authority wasn't explained, it was demonstrated. A toddler who didn't obey instantly wasn't gently redirected. They were corrected in ways designed to teach them that hesitation was not an option. Chores were another early form of discipline. Even very young children were expected to assist in small tasks, picking up objects, fetching little items, helping siblings, staying still when told to remain still, not interfering with livestock, not touching sharp tools, and most importantly, staying out of the way. Toddlers were thought capable of understanding instructions because medieval adults interpreted understanding not as comprehension, but as obedience. A child didn't need to know why something was required. They just needed to do it. Because of this, correction often occurred for actions toddlers couldn't realistically control. Impulsivity was treated as intentional. Curiosity was treated as boldness. Noise was treated as misbehavior. If a toddler wandered off, adults assumed it was deliberate defiance rather than curiosity. If the toddler grabbed a pot or a tool, adults assumed it was willful disobedience rather than instinct. Medieval discipline wasn't concerned with developmental psychology because medieval people didn't have developmental psychology. They had expectations. Adults believed that toddlers were fully capable of moral choice, even if they weren't fully capable of language. A toddler might not yet be able to say, "I don't want to," but their actions, in the eyes of adults, communicated the same sentiment, and that sentiment needed to be corrected before it solidified. Toddlers were treated as unrefined adults, not learning humans. The environment itself demanded strict behavior. Medieval homes were filled with dangers: open hearths, boiling pots, heavy tools, sharp blades, and uneven floors. A toddler's curiosity could lead to serious injury or worse. So discipline wasn't only moral, it was practical. If a toddler got too close to a fire, they weren't given a gentle warning. They were corrected in a way designed to make them remember the lesson instantly and permanently. Pain, or fear of pain, was believed to produce caution faster than explanation. Another key element was public behavior. Medieval life was communal. Children were often surrounded by extended family, neighbors, workers, servants, animals, travelers, and countless witnesses. A toddler who acted out wasn't embarrassing, they were incriminating. Their behavior reflected on parents, and parents were judged harshly for indulgent child-rearing. A child who appeared unruly made the entire household look morally lax. So toddlers learned quickly that misbehavior had both immediate consequences at home and social consequences for their reputation. As a result, children didn't get years of playful experimentation. That stage simply didn't exist. Medieval toddlers went from crawling to consequences in a matter of days. Walking meant independence, but in the medieval worldview, independence needed to be controlled before it grew teeth. So, congratulations. You can walk. Here's obedience, responsibility, and discipline. Because in medieval Europe, the moment you could move, you were expected to behave like someone worth following. If there is one universal truth about toddlers, it is that they cry. They cry because they are tired, hungry, startled, slightly confused, too happy, not happy enough, or simply because a nearby breeze offended them. Modern parents prepare for this with pacifiers, soft words, and cartoon distractions. Medieval parents? They prepared with suspicion. In medieval Europe, crying was not viewed as an involuntary emotional release or a developmental response to stress. Oh no, crying was a statement, and not a flattering one. A child who cried was immediately interpreted through three uncharitable lenses: weakness, manipulation, or defiance. Any of these were considered serious concerns, and none were considered accidental. To medieval adults, children were expected to develop emotional restraint early. A child who cried too easily was believed to have a fragile spirit, one too soft for a world that demanded endurance. Tears symbolized a lack of discipline, not the kind that required punishment, but the kind that required correction. Adults believed that indulging a child's tears would not soothe them, it would encourage them, and an encouraged crier was a dangerous creature indeed. Let's break down why, because the medieval logic here is as intense as it is revealing. First, crying was seen as weakness, and medieval society had absolutely no use for fragility. Life was harsh, unpredictable, and often unforgiving. Survival depended on physical stamina and emotional toughness. Adults believed that children needed to learn to suppress their feelings in order to withstand sickness, hunger, cold, and loss. Tears were viewed as cracks in the moral armor a child needed to survive adulthood. A crying child wasn't just upset, they were signaling insufficient resilience. To medieval adults, comforting them wasn't the solution. Hardening them was. Second, crying was seen as a form of manipulation. Medieval adults assumed children were keen observers who learned very quickly what behaviors got them attention. A crying child was believed to be testing their parents' resolve. Were they hurt? Maybe. Were they tired? Possibly. But were they using tears to get their way? Almost certainly. Adults believed that giving in to crying reinforced bad habits, teaching the child that emotional displays could bend authority. And in a culture that valued strict hierarchy, nothing was more unacceptable than a child learning to influence adults. Third, and perhaps most importantly, crying could be interpreted as defiance. A child who cried after being corrected wasn't expressing pain or frustration. They were expressing rebellion. Their tears were seen as resistance to authority, a refusal to accept punishment quietly and with humility. If a child cried loudly or dramatically, it wasn't viewed as distress. It was viewed as a challenge. Adults believed that a child's willingness to express visible emotion during discipline showed they had not yet submitted fully to correction. This meant that children were discouraged from crying not through soothing words but through additional discipline. A child who cried during punishment was often punished again for crying, not because adults were trying to be cruel, but because they believed that stopping the tears was as important as stopping the misbehavior. Tears were secondary rebellions that had to be addressed immediately. Another layer behind this harsh emotional standard was the medieval obsession with composure. Adults believed that self-control was evidence of moral strength. If a child learned to control their outward emotions early, they were believed to be developing a sturdy, trustworthy character. A child who held back tears was respected. A child who cried openly was pitied or criticized. Stoicism was admired. Vulnerability was not. In many households, children learned quickly that crying brought more attention than comfort, and not the good kind. Parents, grandparents, older siblings, and even neighbors often intervened when a child cried, reprimanding them for noise, disruption, or emotional excess. Children who expressed their feelings openly were seen as badly raised, lacking discipline, or even spiritually weak. Crying also had social implications. Medieval life was deeply communal, with families sharing living spaces, workspaces, and daily routines. A crying child disrupted more than just parental peace, it disrupted the household or the village. People were quick to judge a household with crying children as indulgent or improperly managed. A silent home was a well-run home. A loud home suggested chaos. Because of this, emotional control was enforced early and consistently. Children were taught sometimes with harsh reinforcement, that expressing sadness, frustration, or fear publicly was shameful. Tears were to be hidden, swallowed, or ignored. Emotional expression was seen not as communication, but as a failure of self-regulation. This created a world where children learned quickly that it was safer to remain quiet during pain, disappointment, or fear than to show any visible distress. Medieval children didn't whine. They endured. At least, they endured in public. Crying in private happened. Of course, children are human, but the public face of medieval childhood was expected to be one of calm obedience. Even when children witnessed tragedy, which happened often, given the era's mortality rates, they were expected to maintain composure. Grief was allowed, but quietly. Sobbing, wailing, or prolonged crying were discouraged, especially in children. Adults believed the world was too full of sorrow for people to indulge in emotional display every time pain struck. It's not that medieval adults didn't care when children were sad or hurt. It's that they believed care meant preparing children to live in a world that would not soothe them. A child who learned to swallow tears early would grow into an adult who could survive famine, disease, war, and loss. Emotional control wasn't just discipline, it was training. So yes, in medieval Europe, feelings were technically allowed. But expressing them? That was considered a dangerous luxury. In a society built on endurance, obedience, and unshakable composure, a child's tears weren't just a sound, they were a problem. And problems, in medieval households, were corrected swiftly. In medieval Europe, silence wasn't simply golden, it was virtuous. A silent child was a safe child, a respectable child, and most importantly, a child who did not generate work, chaos, or embarrassment. In a world where noise often meant trouble arguments, fights, accidents, or disruptions, quietness was celebrated as the mark of a well-formed young person. A quiet child was praised. A talkative child was scrutinized. And a loud child? That was a catastrophe in miniature. The medieval worldview placed enormous value on order. Daily life depended on cooperation, routine, hierarchy, and predictability. There was no room for spontaneous chatter or childish rambling. A talkative child was seen as distracting, unruly, and possibly even rebellious. Silence, on the other hand, meant you were obedient, respectful, and properly trained. Adults didn't want children who expressed themselves. They wanted children who took up as little space physically and audibly as possible. Why was silence so prized? The answer lies in the medieval obsession with social hierarchy. Every person had a rank, God above nobles, nobles above peasants, adults above children. Speech was tied to status. The more important you were, the more you were permitted to speak. Children, being at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy, were expected to speak rarely, briefly, and only when spoken to. Silence wasn't merely encouraged. It was a form of social obedience. A child who spoke out of turn risked being seen as failing to understand their place. If a child interrupted adults, gave opinions, asked too many questions, or made unnecessary noise, adults interpreted it as a warning sign of potential insubordination. To medieval parents, a child who talked too much wasn't charming, they were brewing trouble. Their voice hinted at a desire for attention or influence, and both were considered inappropriate for someone so low on the social ladder. Silence also created efficiency in households where productivity was essential. Medieval families worked constantly. There were fires to maintain, fields to tend, animals to feed, tools to repair, meals to prepare, and endless physical labor to endure. Children were expected to blend into this cycle without hindering it. Talking slowed attention, talking distracted workers, talking disrupted concentration, and talking created moments where adults had to stop and respond, which, in medieval logic, wasted valuable time. But silence wasn't just about obedience or efficiency. It was also tied to the medieval belief that children should absorb everything quietly. Learning was supposed to be passive. A child's job was to observe adults, not converse with them. Talking was believed to weaken listening skills, and listening was how children learned proper behavior. A quiet child was considered attentive. A talkative one was believed to be ignoring important lessons. These expectations applied everywhere. Home, church, market, field, feast hall, and even during punishments. Children were trained early to sit still, remain silent, and avoid drawing attention to themselves. If a toddler babbled too loudly, the sound wasn't considered cute. It was considered disruptive. If an older child laughed at the wrong moment, it wasn't seen as joyful. It was seen as disrespectful. Medieval adults did not differentiate between intentional mischief and innocent noise. They judged the noise itself. This, unsurprisingly, meant that punishing talkative children was common. Some adults corrected children harshly for asking questions. Others punished them for making comments, telling stories, or even humming. A child who talked back something modern parents may interpret as independence was punished not for the tone but for the act of speaking at all. Medieval etiquette manuals hammered this point repeatedly. Children were instructed to keep their eyes lowered, their hands still, and their mouths closed. They were not to speak during meals, unless addressed. They were not to interrupt adults under any circumstances. They were not to share opinions. They were not to complain. They were not to tell stories unprompted. And they definitely were not to question instructions. A child who successfully achieved this level of silence was praised as good, well-bred, or properly controlled. These weren't compliments about personality. They were compliments about training. A silent child was proof of effective parenting. A child who made noise was evidence of parental failure. Silence wasn't just a personal virtue. It was a public performance of family discipline. The social pressure to raise quiet children was immense. Neighbors judged families by how noisy their children were. A household filled with chatter was considered undisciplined. A household filled with silence was seen as orderly and respectable. Medieval communities valued predictability, and predictable children rarely spoke. Even in moments where children might naturally express emotion, fear, excitement, curiosity, they were expected to contain it. Grim endurance was the ideal. Medieval stories praised children who suffered in silence or who held their tongue even in pain. These tales reinforced the belief that quietness wasn't merely good behavior, it was a sign of inner strength. This culture of silence also extended to education. Teachers expected students to listen, memorize, and obey without speaking unless explicitly called upon. A child who asked too many questions wasn't admired. They were criticized for talking instead of absorbing. Medieval instruction valued rote repetition, not dialogue. Conversation was a privilege reserved for adults, scholars, clergy, and those with authority. The expectation of silence shaped children profoundly. Many learned to suppress curiosity, emotion, and self-expression simply to avoid punishment or disapproval. Speaking became something risky, something that needed to be calculated carefully. Medieval children learned quickly that their voices were liabilities unless used sparingly and safely. So yes, the best medieval child was the one you forgot was there. Not because they were unimportant, but because silence was their greatest proof of virtue. In medieval Europe, the home was not a democracy, it was a courtroom, and not the friendly kind with juries, defense lawyers, or helpful clerks. No, the medieval household operated under a judicial system, where the father was the judge, the jury, the executioner, and sometimes the courtroom audience too. Children, meanwhile, played a single recurring role, the defendant who always lost. Medieval society was built on strict hierarchies, and the family was the smallest and most heavily enforced version of this structure. At the top stood the father, a position not merely symbolic, but legally and culturally recognized as a miniature lord within his domain. His authority wasn't shared, questioned, or diluted. He was the law. Mothers also disciplined children, but fathers carried the ultimate power, the final verdict, and the unquestioned right to enforce order however they saw fit. Household discipline wasn't a side activity, it was an expectation. Medieval texts on family life described the father not as a companion or mentor, but as a moral overseer. He was responsible for shaping the spiritual, behavioral, and practical development of the children, and because of this responsibility, society granted him tremendous authority. To medieval adults, raising obedient children meant raising socially acceptable adults. Therefore, maintaining discipline within the household was considered a duty, not a preference. This judicial structure began early. From a young age, Children were taught who held authority. The father's presence commanded silence, obedience, and structure. When he entered a room, children straightened their posture, lowered their eyes, and stopped whatever conversation they were having. Speaking out of turn wasn't simply rude, it was borderline unthinkable. Children didn't interrupt the judge. Any misbehavior, large or small, was immediately placed under the father's jurisdiction. A child who broke something, failed a chore, spoke too loudly, disobeyed an instruction, or caused inconveniences was brought before the only court that mattered, the household. There was no investigation. The father's interpretation of events was all that mattered. A child caught in trouble wasn't asked for an explanation. They were told what their explanation should have been. The father's authority was backed by two deeply ingrained beliefs. Children were inherently unreliable and needed strong control. A father's judgment was superior by virtue of age, gender, and God-given hierarchy. There was no middle ground. Children weren't given the benefit of the doubt. If something went wrong, it was assumed they were responsible, careless, or inattentive. A father's word settled everything, and no one, not the mother, siblings, or neighbours, would dare overturn his ruling. Domestic punishment varied widely by household, but certain themes were nearly universal. Punishment had to be swift, memorable, and unquestionable. Fathers believed that delaying punishment softened its impact. Medieval thinking prized immediacy. A consequence delivered in the moment supposedly carved the lesson deeper into the child's memory. A father often viewed himself as correcting not only behaviour but moral trajectory. This absolute authority didn't just apply to major offences. Minor infractions, hesitation, untidiness, sloppy work, accidental spills, poorly done chores could also earn punishment. Medieval daily life was filled with tasks, tools, and responsibilities. A child who failed to perform correctly made life harder for the entire household, and the father ensured such failures weren't repeated. In wealthier homes, the father's role as judge extended even further. Noble or merchant children lived under highly structured routines, and fathers enforced behavior that reflected family status. Any slip, improper posture, incorrect speech, clumsiness, or showing emotion at the wrong time was considered a stain on the family's reputation. Fathers in such households took discipline incredibly seriously because social perception was a currency, and children were expected to protect it through perfect behavior. In peasant homes, the father's authority was just as strong, but the stakes were different. A child's error wasn't a social embarrassment, it was a practical inconvenience. Losing a tool, delaying a task, or upsetting an animal could ruin hours of labour or threaten the family's survival. Discipline enforced reliability. Fathers believed that strict control prepared children to contribute effectively to the household economy. In this setting, discipline wasn't about appearances, it was about survival. It's important to understand that the medieval concept of fatherly authority wasn't cruel for the sake of cruelty. To medieval adults, this was simply how order functioned. Everyone had someone above them. Lords answered to kings, kings answered to God, wives answered to husbands, children answered to everyone. This hierarchical worldview made the father's dominance feel natural, not oppressive. And appealing the father's judgment? Impossible. Medieval children didn't say, "But that's not fair." There was no space for fairness. Punishments weren't negotiated. There were no second chances or, "Let's talk about it later." When the father delivered a verdict, the household moved on, except the child, who moved on with new discipline reinforced, often painfully. Family court even extended to emotional expression. A child who sulked after punishment risked additional correction for disrespect. A child who looked resentful risked correction for defiance. Children were expected not only to obey the verdict, but to accept it gracefully. The father wasn't just teaching behavior, he was shaping attitude. This model of discipline taught children to internalize hierarchy. It created adults who accepted authority without question, and medieval society depended heavily on this kind of compliance. A child raised in an environment where the father was the unquestioned judge grew into an adult who understood their place in the social order, who obeyed lords, priests, and masters with the same unquestioning submission. So yes, family court had one judge and no appeals. The rulings were immediate. the sentences were non-negotiable, and the lessons were meant to last a lifetime. In medieval Europe, the home was filled with tools for cooking, tools for farming, tools for weaving, tools for cleaning, and tools for disciplining children. And the unsettling part? These categories weren't neatly separated. Medieval households didn't own specialized devices for punishment because they didn't need them. Nearly every object in the home, from the wooden spoon to the fire poker, had a second life as a behavioral adjustment instrument. To a modern viewer, this sounds harsh, but to medieval adults, it was practical, efficient, and perfectly normal. A house was not a child-proofed environment. It was a workspace, and everything within it served some kind of purpose. If a child misbehaved, whatever tool was closest became the tool of correction. There was no dramatic pause while a parent retrieved a designated discipline device. The medieval philosophy was simple. The nearest object wins. This meant children learned to view household items with a mixture of familiarity and fear. A broom wasn't just for sweeping, it was for emphasizing obedience. A belt wasn't just for holding trousers, it was for rapid moral realignment. A shoe wasn't just for walking, it doubled as a behavioral reset button. Even objects meant for comfort, like a wooden ladle used for stirring soup, could swiftly become part of the medieval family justice system. And because everything doubled as a potential disciplinary tool, children learned to be cautious around objects, cautious around adults, and cautious around the combination of the two. Medieval homes were filled with hazards, but nothing made a child more nervous than a parent calmly reaching for an item the child had just handled incorrectly. If a child broke a pot, the shard wasn't the only sharp thing in the room. One of the most common tools was the birch switch thin, flexible branches tied together and used for swift discipline. It was easy to gather, easy to use, and easy to keep handy. Many children dreaded the sound of branches rustling outside in the yard, because that sound often meant someone was preparing a fresh switch. Parents didn't store these for long-term use. They made new ones as needed. In a way, nature itself provided the medieval household with an endless supply of discipline. But the birch switch had competition. The wooden spoon, innocent to modern eyes, was a medieval icon of swift parental action. It sat on the hearth or kitchen table all day, ready to stir broth or correct behavior. You could be reaching for stew one moment and delivering a lesson the next. Medieval children were not confused about this dual purpose. They learned early that silence during kitchen work wasn't just polite, it was self-preservation. Then there were belts, straps, and rawhide pieces, common in households that needed to secure clothing, bind tools, or restrain animals. These items were incredibly durable, and durability was an unfortunate advantage when repurposed for discipline. A leather strap could become an implement of correction with startling speed. Parents valued these objects because they didn't break, didn't splinter, and didn't require preparation. A strap was always ready, always nearby, and always effective. In some homes, the wooden paddle or flatboard served as a multi-use item. It could knead dough in the morning, help turn cheese in the afternoon, and correct noisy children by evening. Medieval children quickly learned which flatboards were safe to touch and which ones were suspiciously smooth on one side. A smooth paddle was rarely just for baking. Importantly, this dual-use culture wasn't about cruelty, it was about convenience. Medieval households didn't have many possessions. A family might own a handful of essential utensils, 2 or 3 pieces of furniture, and a scattering of tools. There was no storage space, no room for novelty items, and certainly no justification for a specialized punishment stick when the house already contained a dozen suitable substitutes. Clothing items could also become tools of discipline. Gloves could swat, boots could nudge, cloaks could yank. Even the cords used to tie garments could deliver sharp reminders to stay in line. Medieval children were acutely aware that anything within reaching distance might serve as an impromptu disciplinary tool. And because these tools were woven so seamlessly into daily life, the line between ordinary object and punishment object remained intentionally blurry. Children were expected to remember the lesson but not hold resentment toward the object or the parent. Adults believed that discipline, no matter how painful, should be forgotten quickly. The idea wasn't to traumatize, it was to shape behavior. Holding grudges was considered disobedience, and disobedience was guaranteed to earn more discipline. One of the more surprising tools, especially for modern readers, was the hearth poker, a metal implement used to adjust burning logs. It wasn't used frequently, nor was it used harshly, but smaller taps with it were enough to make a memorable impression. Medieval fire pokers came in many shapes and sizes, and while they weren't meant to harm children, their cold metal made them a frightening presence in any household encounter. Beyond tools, furniture itself could become part of discipline. A child could be made to kneel on wooden floors, stand in corners, brace against tables, or sit motionless on stools for extended periods. Comfort wasn't the point, stillness was. The discomfort of hard surfaces served as a physical reminder that misbehavior had consequences. Medieval children didn't grow up surrounded by pillows, rugs, and padded chairs. Everything was wood, stone, iron, or straw, and each material offered its own type of correction when used creatively. Children learned early that the world was full of potential hazards, and many of them were in the house itself. Not because parents wanted to scare them, but because medieval adults believed discipline kept households functioning, apprentices learning, and children alive long enough to become useful adults. And so, yes, everything in the house had a second job. Or, if you were a medieval child, a second job you prayed it wouldn't remember. If medieval discipline had a greatest hit, it wasn't the stick, the switch, or the wooden spoon, it was shame. Shame was cheap, effective, memorable, and could be applied anywhere, anytime, with no tools required. And in a world where daily life was communal, noisy, crowded, and relentlessly public, humiliation was one of the most accessible parenting strategies available. In medieval Europe, privacy was not a childhood privilege. Children were surrounded by adults at every hour. Family members, neighbours, workers, visitors, animals, and occasionally half the village. A medieval child might never be truly alone until they were old enough to do chores far from home. This lack of privacy made public shaming effortless. Why correct your child quietly when you had a built-in audience to reinforce the lesson? To modern ears, public humiliation sounds brutal. To medieval adults, it was just reality. Shame was believed to sear lessons into memory with far more permanence than a scolding whispered in private. If a child felt embarrassed in front of others, they would remember the mistake vividly and avoid repeating it. Humiliation was, in a way, considered the medieval version of natural consequences, except the nature in question was other humans staring at you disapprovingly. The most common form of public shaming was verbal humiliation. A parent would loudly announce a child's mistake so everyone present would hear it. If a child spilled something, mispronounced a word, performed a chore poorly, or interrupted an adult, the speed with which the news spread depended only on how close the nearest neighbour was. Parents corrected children loudly, confidently, and without hesitation. Medieval culture didn't see this as cruelty. It saw it as honesty. Adults believed that shame taught humility, and humility was a virtue. A child who learned humility early was considered morally safer than one who grew up confident, outspoken, or worst of all, proud. Medieval society did not celebrate childhood confidence. Confidence was interpreted as arrogance, and arrogance was believed to lead straight to disaster. Humiliation trimmed ego, taught perspective, and kept children in their place. Parents deployed shame with creativity too. Some scolded children in front of guests. Some sent misbehaving children to stand outside the door where passers-by could see them. Some made children announce their mistake to family members, reinforcing obedience through forced confession. And some used the village itself as a disciplinary witness, calling out their child's behavior in the marketplace or at communal wells. Because medieval life was so intertwined, neighbors joined in. Other adults didn't hesitate to comment on a child's misbehavior, sometimes adding their own critique, sometimes offering advice that sounded suspiciously like insults. Children learned quickly that misbehavior was not only a family affair, it was a community event. Parents didn't mind this. In fact, many expected it. Discipline was considered a shared responsibility, and shame flowed freely from anyone who felt invested in raising obedient children. A child's reputation mattered, and adults treated that reputation as a moral ledger. If the ledger reflected disobedience, the village would fix it with words sharper than any wooden rod. In some cases, shaming took physical forms not through pain, but through embarrassing tasks or positions. A child might be made to stand in the center of a room, hands folded, while adults continued their activities, pointedly ignoring them. Some were told to wear an object symbolizing their mistake, a dirty apron for laziness, an out-of-place hat for carelessness, or a heavy object to symbolize their error. These weren't fancy punishments. They were improvised on the spot to send a clear message. Public correction during chores was also common. If a child failed to carry out a task correctly, say, gathering water or sweeping the floor, a parent might force them to redo it, while announcing every error loudly enough for others to hear. Medieval children often worked in shared spaces, fields, workshops, communal ovens, so missteps became public knowledge almost instantly. Correcting a child publicly ensured the mistake became a lesson for not just the child, but any others watching. One of the most powerful elements of medieval shame was the fear of ridicule, something children learned to understand early. Being laughed at by adults wasn't considered cruel, it was considered instructive. Laughter could crush pride, discourage foolishness, and reinforce the seriousness of proper behavior. A child who became the subject of adult amusement was unlikely to forget the feeling. Shame also worked because medieval communities relied heavily on reputation. Even children had reputations, quiet ones, stubborn ones, obedient ones, troublesome ones. These labels had long-term consequences. A child who gained a negative reputation might struggle socially, lose opportunities for apprenticeships, or be judged more harshly for future mistakes. Parents used public shaming to steer their children away from these dangerous reputational paths. But perhaps the most striking aspect of medieval public humiliation was how casually it was used. Adults didn't reserve it for major offences. They used it for anything that indicated poor behaviour, poor manners, poor focus, or poor judgment. A child who tripped, a child who froze, a child who forgot instructions, anything could trigger a public correction. Medieval parents didn't consider the emotional impact. They considered the practical impact. This child won't forget next time. Ironically, the sheer normalcy of public shaming meant children rarely saw it as unusual. They expected corrections to be loud. They expected embarrassment. They expected witnesses. It was the air medieval childhood breathed. Uncomfortable, communal, corrective. Privacy belonged to adults. Children lived their lives fully observed, fully judged, and fully exposed to whatever lesson adults felt they needed next. And for medieval parents, shame wasn't the opposite of care. It was care, just delivered loudly, creatively, and in front of as many people as possible. For a medieval child, dinner was not a relaxing family gathering where everyone chatted about their day. It wasn't even a meal in the modern sense. It was a trial, a ceremony, a silent performance in which children attempted the impossible. Sitting perfectly still, perfectly straight, perfectly quiet, and perfectly obedient, while surrounded by food they were not allowed to touch, comment on, or even glance at too eagerly. Medieval dinner tables were not places of warmth or conversation. They were arenas of etiquette, where even adults behaved rigidly, and children were expected to behave even better. To medieval adults, mealtime discipline reflected a household's order, respectability, and moral fibre. A child misbehaving at dinner wasn't just inconvenient, it was a sign of a family losing control. The standards were clear, strict, and merciless. First, silence was mandatory. Speaking during meals without being spoken to was a direct challenge to social hierarchy. Mealtime was for eating, not for sharing feelings, recounting events, or asking questions. Children were expected to keep their lips sealed unless an adult addressed them directly, an event so rare it ranked somewhere between seeing a comet and encountering a polite goat. A child who tried to speak unprompted, whether to ask for bread or announce they were choking, risked immediate correction. Medieval parents valued quiet meals above child comfort, and many children learned to swallow small emergencies as discreetly as possible. Silence was part of discipline, but it was also part of showing respect. An obedient child was a quiet child was a good child. Therefore, good children didn't talk while chewing, sitting, or breathing too enthusiastically. Second, posture mattered a lot. Medieval children were expected to sit with straight backs, hands placed neatly in their laps, unless actively eating, and eyes fixed on their own plate or occasionally on the floor for safety. Slouching was unacceptable. Fidgeting was disrespectful. Leaning elbows on the table was practically a sin. A child who shifted too much, scratched themselves, or attempted a mid-meal wiggle could be sharply corrected. Posture wasn't just about manners, it was about self-discipline. Medieval adults believed that sitting still trained the soul. A child who could endure an entire meal without moving was seen as a child capable of resisting temptation elsewhere. It was spiritual endurance disguised as dinner etiquette. Third, children waited. Always. Medieval meals operated on a strict eating hierarchy. Adults ate first, especially fathers or masters of the house. Children might be served last, or in some households, not served at all until adults were finished. Waiting was not considered cruelty. It was a lesson in patience and respect. Children watched adults enjoy their meals while they sat perfectly still, fighting the urge to fidget or stare longingly at the food. Waiting wasn't merely passive. Children had to maintain their posture, silence, and composure while hunger gnawed at them. It was a test of discipline disguised as good manners. Any sign of impatience, licking lips, shifting in place, or staring too intensely at the food was corrected immediately. A child's job was to pretend they were not hungry until adults confirmed they could be. Fourth, touch nothing. Children were explicitly forbidden from touching food until permission was granted, and permission was not given lightly. A child who reached for bread without being told could be scolded publicly, swatted, or even removed from the table entirely. Medieval adults viewed self-control around food as a critical virtue, partly because food was precious and partly because hunger was seen as a test of character. And touching the tableware? Even worse. Grabbing the wrong knife, touching a communal dish, or lifting a cup without instruction signaled disastrous manners. Medieval etiquette was complex, and children were expected to learn it early. Yet they had to learn it in silence, by watching and silently hoping they didn't misinterpret something and commit a spoon-based offense. Fifth, no visible emotion. You didn't express joy at receiving food, disappointment at receiving too little, disgust at receiving something questionable, or fear at receiving something that was still moving. Emotion of any kind was considered childish. And medieval life already had children, they didn't need childishness too. If a meal tasted awful, children ate it without complaint. If it was delicious, they ate it without enthusiasm. The goal wasn't enjoyment. The goal was disciplined consumption. Children were walking proof that a household operated correctly, and any emotional outburst, good or bad, threatened that image. Sixth, cleanliness was non-negotiable. Eating neatly was a core expectation. Children had to avoid spills, crumbs, stains, or stray drips. A child who made a mess wasn't labelled clumsy, they were labelled poorly trained. Medieval adults believed a child's mealtime discipline predicted their future discipline in every other area of life. If a child couldn't keep their food on their plate, how could they possibly be trusted with tasks requiring precision? Seventh, obedience over appetite. Medieval children didn't get second servings unless offered. They didn't ask for more. They didn't refuse what was given. They didn't negotiate. Portions weren't adjusted for preferences. Food wasn't tailored to tastes. A child's likes and dislikes were irrelevant compared to the importance of demonstrating obedience. Finally, meals were moral performances. The dinner table was where parents proved to guests, neighbours, and themselves that their household ran with dignity and order. A well-behaved child reflected a strong parent. A misbehaving child reflected failure. Reputations could rise or fall on the behaviour of the smallest diners. For a medieval child, dinner was never simply dinner. It was choreography. It was discipline. It was a test of endurance, obedience, and silence. Because in medieval Europe, dinner didn't nourish you. It tested you. And the only thing more dangerous than hunger was drawing attention to yourself while trying to fight it. If a medieval child thought home was strict, school was a revelation, a loud, echoing confirmation that adults everywhere shared the same philosophy. Learning should hurt, and not metaphorically. Pain was as essential to medieval education as ink, parchment, or the alphabet itself. To teach a child without hitting them was considered ineffective, indulgent, and frankly irresponsible. Medieval schools were not gentle places full of curious exploration, supportive teachers, or colourful instructional materials. They were closer to boot camps, designed to break wills before shaping minds. The idea wasn't to nurture learning, it was to enforce it. Memory was carved, not cultivated, and every lesson came with the unspoken rule: you will pay for your mistakes, one way or another. The schoolmaster was the undisputed monarch of this miniature kingdom. He ruled with absolute authority, iron discipline, and a collection of painful teaching aids that doubled as instructional tools and behavioral correction devices. His rod, switch, or strap was not hidden, it was displayed openly, like a medieval version of classroom decor. Some schoolmasters hung their rods on the wall for all to see. Others kept them tucked under the arm, a constant reminder that grammar wasn't the only thing students were expected to grasp. Why so much emphasis on physical discipline? The answer lies in medieval educational philosophy. Fear sharpens focus. To medieval adults, the idea that children might want to learn was laughable. Children didn't seek knowledge, they resisted it. Therefore, learning required coercion, and coercion required force. The schoolmaster wasn't simply teaching reading or arithmetic. He was wrestling ignorance and stubbornness out of his pupils one strike at a time. Children who failed to memorize lessons weren't considered forgetful, they were considered willfully defiant. A child who misread a line, reversed letters, or stumbled over Latin declensions wasn't struggling. They were disrespecting the sacred pursuit of knowledge, and disrespect demanded correction. Medieval schoolmasters believed that the mind learned through the body. If the mind refused to remember, the body would remind it. Lessons began early, long before a child mastered posture or courage. Schools were often cold, dimly lit rooms in churches, guild halls, or cramped wooden buildings. Students sat on backless benches, hunched over slabs of wax or scraps of parchment. Their tools were minimal: a stylus, a quill, if they were lucky, and a teacher hovering over them like a storm cloud. Recitation was the core of medieval learning. Children chanted lessons aloud, sometimes for hours, repeating grammar rules, biblical passages, or arithmetic tables. If they mumbled, correction. If they looked bored, correction. If their voice cracked, faltered, or strayed off rhythm, correction again. Medieval schools were loud, but they were not tolerant. Mistakes weren't treated as part of growth. They were treated as moral failures. Teachers saw themselves as guardians of intellectual order, and a child who disrupted that order by getting something wrong had to be realigned. And the correction wasn't delayed. Medieval schoolmasters believed in immediacy. A rod could tap a knuckle before a student even finished a mispronounced word. This was considered efficient teaching. Corporal punishment varied in intensity. Sometimes it was a sharp strike across the hands, the place considered both symbolically and practically appropriate after all. Hands did the writing, so hands should face the consequences of sloppy work. Other times, it was a blow across the back or legs. Some teachers used switches for speed, rods for accuracy, or straps for emphasis. A few used more creative tools, like the flat side of a ruler or the back of a book. Students learned quickly to fear hesitation. Speed mattered. Accuracy mattered. Every second of confusion increased the likelihood of punishment. Medieval children developed extraordinary memorization skills, not because they were naturally gifted, but because forgetting something had consequences far more immediate than academic disappointment. This fear-learning relationship extended beyond academics. Schoolmasters corrected posture, gaze direction, hand placement, and even breathing. Slouch, correction. Look out the window, correction. Whisper, fierce correction. Medieval schools believed that discipline in learning required discipline in everything. The classroom was a miniature world designed to crush distraction at its source. And yet, despite the severity, school was considered a privilege. Most medieval children never attended school and instead worked from an early age. Those who did attend were expected to appreciate the opportunity, even if it occasionally resulted in bruised hands. Parents often supported harsh teaching methods. Many insisted that strict teachers produce smarter children. Schoolmasters who went soft were rumoured to produce lazy students, a fate medieval parents feared more than the occasional welt. Academic content varied by region and social class, but most medieval schooling focused on Latin grammar, scripture, and moral instruction. Children recited prayers, copied passages, and memorized texts that adults believed essential for producing literate, virtuous Christians. Reading and writing were tools for spirituality as much as practicality. Therefore, mistakes weren't simply academic errors, they were failures in moral formation. And moral failures had to be painfully corrected. Even advanced subjects, arithmetic, rhetoric, or rudimentary science, came with the same disciplinary framework. The more complex the subject, the more likely a child was to make mistakes. And mistakes kept the schoolmaster employed. By the time a child left school, whether after a year or a decade, they carried two things with them: knowledge and the memory of how much it had hurt to acquire it. The medieval education system believed these two outcomes were inseparable. You learned your letters, you learned your prayers, you learned your place, and you learned all of it painfully. If medieval schoolmasters had written a teaching philosophy, it would have been short, simple, and terrifying. They learn better when they're scared. Not exactly what modern educators proudly hang in their classrooms, but in medieval Europe, fear wasn't a side effect of education. It was education. Schoolmasters held a level of authority that bordered on absolute. To a medieval child, the teacher was not a guide, not a mentor, not a kindly academic shepherd. He was a force of nature, a thundercloud in human form, an unpredictable, frequently irritated guardian of learning, whose presence alone could silence an entire room of squirming children faster than a modern fire drill alarm. The medieval classroom was built on one principle: the teacher must be feared more than failure, and since failure already hurt, literally, as established in earlier chapters, teachers ensured their personal presence added a second, even more potent layer of dread. This fear began the moment a child entered the schoolroom. Teachers structured their authority very deliberately. The schoolmaster typically stood, walked, or loomed, while students sat crowded, silent, and tense, backs straight, eyes lowered, hands positioned carefully as if prepared for an inspection. Children didn't fidget. They didn't slouch. They didn't relax. Relaxation suggested comfort, and comfort was the enemy of medieval education. The teacher's authority was total. He could raise his voice. He could strike the table. He could rave, scold, lecture, glare, or threaten with no one to contradict him. Parents supported this. In fact, they expected it. A teacher who didn't command fear was considered weak, ineffective, and incapable of producing properly trained students. Parents didn't ask if the teacher was kind. They asked if he was strict. A teacher with a gentle reputation risked losing pupils because fear was seen as part of the service he offered. This created a uniquely charged atmosphere. Medieval students lived in a constant state of vigilance, always watching for signs of the teacher's mood. They learned to interpret every micro-expression, every shift of the teacher's weight, every twitch of the eyebrow. Was he about to call on someone? Was he about to swing the rod? Was he about to announce a memorization test no one had prepared for? Children read their teacher the way sailors read storm clouds. The teacher's unpredictability was not accidental. Many schoolmasters cultivated it. Being unpredictable kept children alert. Being alert meant fewer mistakes. Fewer mistakes meant fewer punishments. Or so medieval logic went. If students didn't know when correction was coming, they behaved as though correction was always coming. This perpetual readiness produced the ideal medieval classroom: silent, tense, and terror-driven. Teachers also used fear to control group behavior. If one student misbehaved, the entire class sometimes suffered. This wasn't considered cruel, it was considered efficient. Punish 10 students for the mistake of one, and suddenly 10 students became watchdogs, ready to hurl glares, shushes, and kicks at anyone who dared step out of line. Peer pressure became an extension of the teacher's authority, and teachers understood the power of silence. Not the silence of well-behaved students, the silence of intimidation. A medieval schoolmaster could quiet a room with nothing more than a sharp inhale, a raised eyebrow, or the slow gesture of picking up a rod. This wasn't theatrics, it was training. Students reacted instantly, almost instinctually, because silence was the only safe sound. Children whispered only when the teacher turned away, and even then, it was risky. The teacher's ears, in a child's imagination, were finely tuned instruments that could detect a single syllable in a crowded, echoing chapel. Fear didn't only control behavior, it controlled learning. A child terrified of being called on made sure they memorized every line. A child terrified of getting the wrong answer practiced relentlessly. A child terrified of disappointing the schoolmaster studied even when exhausted. The medieval classroom wasn't designed for exploration, creativity, or curiosity. Those were luxuries, even dangers. Curiosity could lead to questions, and questions could lead to speaking out of turn, which could lead to discipline. So children learned to stay in their intellectual lanes. They absorbed information exactly as delivered, without analysis or interpretation. The goal wasn't understanding. The goal was obedience. Surprisingly, some schoolmasters genuinely believed this was good for children. Fear, in their view, wasn't a tool of cruelty, it was a tool of shaping. If fear taught discipline, and discipline produced pious, useful adults, then fear was a gift. A harsh one, but a gift nonetheless. Many teachers considered themselves moral guardians, responsible not only for children's minds but for their souls. And souls, in medieval thinking, responded better to fear than gentleness. Teachers also believed fear built character. A frightened child learned to endure hardship. A frightened child learned to submit to authority. A frightened child learned to control impulses. All qualities admired in adulthood. Medieval society admired those who endured without complaint, worked without resistance, and obeyed without question. Where better to practice these traits than in school? Of course, this atmosphere created more than obedience. It created tension, anxiety, and a lifelong association between learning and discomfort. But medieval adults didn't worry about the psychological effects. They worried about the practical ones. If a child left school knowing how to read, write, recite scripture, and follow orders, then the system had worked. By the time a child left a medieval classroom, they didn't just know their lessons, they knew that authority was meant to be feared, that mistakes carried consequences, and that silence was safer than curiosity. In other words, the lesson plan didn't just include terror. It depended on it. And the medieval child learned this faster than any Latin grammar rule ever written. If medieval village schools were strict, then monastic schools were strict with divine enthusiasm. The classroom here wasn't just a place of learning, it was a battleground where teachers fought not only ignorance but sin itself. A child in a monastic school wasn't simply expected to memorize lessons. They were expected to become miniature models of Christian virtue. And nothing shaped virtue quite like a combination of scripture, silence, and strategically applied pain. Monastic schools existed because monasteries were the intellectual centers of medieval Europe. Monks preserved knowledge, copied manuscripts, administered libraries, and oversaw the spiritual education of both novices and select lay children. For a child accepted into a monastic school, the experience was like stepping into an entirely new world, a world ruled by bells, prayers, order, and an ever-present reminder that God, angels, saints, and the schoolmaster were all watching. The spiritual environment radically shaped discipline. Every action, every mistake, every lapse in behavior was interpreted not as childish clumsiness, but as a spiritual deviation. If a child lost focus, it wasn't because the room was cold or the bench uncomfortable, it was because their soul needed correction. If a child daydreamed, adults worried they were inviting sinful thoughts. If a child disobeyed, the monks interpreted it as the influence of temptation. That meant discipline wasn't simply about producing good students, it was about producing good Christians. And spiritual danger required immediate response. Monastic discipline began with strict routines. Days were carved into segments marked by bells. Prayer, breakfast, prayer again, lessons, chores, more prayer, more lessons, silent reflection, and a final round of prayer. The schedule was relentless, and children were expected to transition instantly from one duty to the next without hesitation, grumbling, or yawning. The bells didn't care if a child was tired, cold, or mentally overwhelmed. God's schedule waited for no one. Breaking these routines even accidentally brought swift correction. A child who arrived late to prayer could be reprimanded publicly. A child who spoke during silent reflection might be punished physically. Even minor missteps, like failing to kneel properly or mumbling during scripture reading, were seen as indicators of spiritual laxity and addressed accordingly. In a monastic school, discipline wasn't about keeping order, it was about protecting the soul. The tools of spiritual correction were similar to those used in secular schools: switches, rods, straps, but the justification was different. Monastic teachers believed physical pain cleansed moral weakness. A strike across the hands was not simply a punishment, it was a form of purification. Children learned quickly that discipline wasn't merely a reaction to misbehavior, it was a form of spiritual hygiene. Teachers often reinforced the spiritual significance of punishment. A child might be reminded that the body must learn humility so the soul may rise, or that better pain now than damnation later. These weren't empty sayings, they reflected genuine belief. Monastic educators approached discipline with the seriousness of priests performing a sacrament. In their eyes, physical correction was a necessary part of shaping a righteous life. Because of this religious intensity, fear operated differently in monastic schools. Children didn't fear just the teacher's rod, they feared disappointing God. The teacher wasn't the only authority figure monitoring their behavior. Heavenly surveillance loomed large. Children were reminded that angels recorded every act, every word, every stray thought. This omnipresent sense of being watched made discipline not only external but internal. Guilt became a tool. Fear became a framework. One of the defining features of monastic schools was their emphasis on memorization of scripture. Children spent hours reciting psalms, passages from the Gospels, and moral lessons from saints' lives. Mistakes were not only academic failures, they were signs the child wasn't giving their full heart to God's word. A sloppy recitation didn't merely disappoint the teacher, it insulted the divine text itself, and the stick helped ensure children remembered that. Silence in monastic schools carried special weight. Silence wasn't just good behavior, it was spiritual discipline. Children learned the art of holy stillness. Hands folded, eyes lowered, breaths quiet. A child who fidgeted during prayer disrupted not only the routine, but the sanctity of the moment. Correction followed swiftly because silence was considered essential to cultivating humility and obedience. Chores in the monastery added another layer of discipline. Children might assist with gardening, cleaning, carrying water, or helping in the scriptorium. These tasks were not viewed as mundane work, they were viewed as moral training. Performing them without complaint was considered a sign of spiritual maturity. Performing them poorly suggested the child lacked the discipline necessary to serve God properly, and poor performance, naturally, triggered correction. One distinctive feature of monastic discipline was public penance. Instead of physical punishment alone, some schools assigned spiritually symbolic penalties. A child who broke a rule might be asked to kneel in the chapel for an extended period, stand silently holding a candle, copy a passage of scripture multiple times, or confess their error aloud. These acts of penance reinforced the idea that discipline was not about pain, it was about repentance. Humiliation also played a role, but it was framed in religious terms. A child who misbehaved might be reminded that pride was a deadly sin. Being corrected publicly was seen as humbling, and humility was a virtue monks prized deeply. Thus, embarrassment wasn't cruelty, it was moral medicine. Despite the severity, many medieval parents admired monastic schools because they produced children who were disciplined, obedient, literate, and devout, qualities prized in any social class. A child trained by monks was considered spiritually sturdy, intellectually capable, and properly humbled. The bruises were temporary, the virtues were eternal. So in monastic classrooms, every lesson came with two observers, the teacher holding the rod and God holding the ledger. And for the medieval child, that meant learning was holy, learning was serious, and learning hurt for reasons both earthly and divine. In medieval Europe, prayer wasn't an optional spiritual exercise. It was the heartbeat of daily life, the soundtrack of every hour, and the first measure by which a child's discipline and soul was judged. Forgetting your prayers wasn't a small slip. It was a spiritual misfire with consequences that arrived faster than divine forgiveness. To medieval adults, prayer was more than devotion. It was evidence. Evidence of obedience, evidence of proper upbringing, evidence that a child respected God's authority and the family's reputation. A child who remembered their prayers was morally promising. A child who forgot them was morally questionable. And a child who deliberately avoided them, that was practically an invitation to spiritual disaster. Because prayer was woven into the fabric of medieval timekeeping, children were expected to recite certain prayers multiple times a day upon waking, before meals, after meals, before bed, and often during moments of daily ritual. These prayers were short, memorized, and repeated so consistently that adults believed there was no excuse for forgetting them. If a child failed to recite properly, adults assumed the child wasn't trying hard enough, wasn't paying attention, or wasn't spiritually serious. In households with strong religious routines, prayer recitation was treated with the same scrutiny as a legal oath. Children were quizzed randomly during chores, at dinner, or while preparing for bed. Parents demanded perfect wording, clear articulation, and unwavering concentration. A wrong word wasn't just a mistake, it was a sign of weak devotion, and weak devotion needed correction. The consequences for forgetting prayers varied, but none of them were gentle. The mildest response was a stern scolding, layered with spiritual caution. Adults reminded children that forgetting prayers displeased God, saddened angels, or risked inviting temptation. This wasn't hyperbole. Medieval adults believed children were spiritually unstable by nature. Forgetfulness wasn't natural, it was a door cracked open for sin. But most consequences weren't mild. Physical punishment was common, but with a religious twist. A child who forgot their morning prayer might get struck on the hands while being told to remember with your body what your mind forgot. A child who stumbled over a bedtime prayer might receive correction designed to ensure they never forgot again. Adults believed physical reinforcement carved lessons deeper, and spiritual lessons needed to be carved deepest of all. Forgetting prayers during formal settings like family devotions or church was even more serious. A child who stuttered, lost track of words, or failed to answer properly during catechism could be punished publicly. This reinforced two messages. Prayer was serious, and so was the family's reputation. Medieval villagers took religious propriety seriously, and a child who couldn't recite correctly embarrassed not only themselves but their entire household. Schoolmasters and clergy took this even further. In monastic or cathedral schools, prayer accuracy was treated as a sacred responsibility. A child who recited incorrectly might have to repeat the prayer dozens of times under supervision. If they still couldn't remember, teachers assumed the child's heart was resisting proper devotion and corrected them physically. For many medieval educators, a child's failure to memorize prayers wasn't intellectual, it was spiritual defiance. Some children were assigned ritual penance as punishment. If they forgot a prayer, they might have to kneel for long periods on cold stone floors, repeat the prayer until their voice cracked, hold a candle or token representing repentance, spend time in silent reflection, monitored closely, copy the prayer repeatedly with ink or stylus. These penances weren't optional. They were meant to restore spiritual order. Parents and teachers believed that requiring physical or mental exertion purified the child's forgetful mind and strengthened their moral resolve. It wasn't enough to punish the mistake, the child had to demonstrate active devotion afterward. Children quickly learned that prayer was a memory test they were not allowed to fail. A small stumble could trigger punishment. An incorrect phrase could spark a lecture. Forgetting entirely, that was unthinkable. Medieval parents didn't care if a child was tired, distracted, frightened, or hungry. The prayer had to be said correctly, and said with seriousness. Even tone mattered. A prayer spoken too quickly suggested laziness. A prayer spoken quietly suggested reluctance. A prayer spoken with hesitation suggested inattentiveness. Children developed the ability to recite flawlessly, not because they understood the meaning, but because they understood the consequences. This emphasis on ritual precision meant medieval children became masters of rote memorization. They carried dozens of prayers in their heads, repeated them constantly, and practiced them silently during chores or play. A child whispering to themselves while carrying a bucket wasn't talking to imaginary friends. They were rehearsing survival. In many ways, Fear and faith were inseparable for medieval children. They didn't experience prayer as peaceful meditation. It was a mandated performance that shaped their relationship with the divine through stress, vigilance, and repetition. Adults believed this was healthy. They believed children needed strong guidance to become spiritually disciplined adults. And discipline, as always, was enforced through consequences. For medieval children, the message was clear. Prayers kept you safe from sin. Prayers kept you safe from punishment. Prayers kept you safe from embarrassment. Forgetting them did the opposite. So yes, wrong words brought the right consequences. And in a world where God watched from above and adults watched from across the room, a medieval child learned very quickly that prayer wasn't something you believed. It was something you remembered perfectly. Or else, in medieval Europe, punishment didn't always come with noise. Sometimes it came with silence, specifically the silence of an empty bowl. Hunger was one of the most common, most effective, and most memorable disciplinary tools adults used on children. If you misbehaved, you didn't get time out. You got time without food. Hunger was the medieval equivalent of grounding. Except grounding ends when your parents feel merciful. Hunger ends when someone decides you've learned enough from your stomach's complaints. To understand this form of discipline, you must first understand medieval food culture. Meals were not guaranteed. Food was precious. Food was seasonal. Food took work, hours of labor, unpredictable harvests, and a daily battle against spoilage. Every loaf of bread represented effort. Every bowl of pottage represented ingredients that might not return until next season. When food held this much value, losing your meal wasn't symbolic, it was serious. So naturally, adults used it as leverage. Medieval parents believed hunger taught lessons quickly. If a child disobeyed, acted disrespectfully, performed chores carelessly, or pushed boundaries, withholding a meal was seen as a practical way to reinforce consequences. After all, pain fades. Lectures fade faster. But hunger stayed until it convinced you that whatever you did, you would never do again. The punishment didn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes it was as simple as, you don't eat tonight. Other times, more subtle, you'll have less than usual. Or, you'll wait until everyone else is served. Or, you can eat after the work is finished. The severity varied, but the logic was the same. A child who felt the sharp reminder of an empty stomach would remember obedience far longer than a child whose punishment only stung the skin. One reason hunger was used so frequently is because it required no tools, no time, and no physical exertion from adults. Withholding food cost nothing and communicated everything. It conveyed disappointment, authority, and the seriousness of the offense all in one gesture. Adults believed that if a child learned to respect the value of food early, they would respect the value of labor, time, and social order later. This wasn't limited to households either. Schools, monasteries, and workshops also used hunger as a disciplinary method. A child who misbehaved during lessons might be denied their portion at lunch. A novice who slipped during a ritual might be given only bread and water for the evening. An apprentice who angered a master might be told to finish their tasks before eating tasks which conveniently took longer than daylight allowed. But perhaps the most unique aspect of hunger as punishment was the way it intertwined with shame. Daily meals were communal, and being denied food was often a public spectacle. A child forced to sit at the table without eating became a silent cautionary tale for every other child watching. No one wanted to be the one with an empty plate while siblings or classmates filled their stomachs. Hunger was bad. Hunger with witnesses was worse. Children learned to associate food with both survival and behavior. Eating wasn't a right. It was something you earned through obedience. If you wanted a full meal, you had to contribute to the household, respect adults, and avoid missteps. For medieval adults, tying nourishment to behavior created immediate, predictable compliance. Not every punishment meant total denial. Sometimes children received reduced portions, especially in households already struggling with scarcity. A child might receive crusts instead of a full slice of bread, watered-down pottage instead of the thicker ladlefuls adults enjoyed, or be forced to wait until the last scraps were distributed if any were left at all. In a world where hunger was a constant threat, such reductions were powerful motivators. In some households, children weren't allowed to eat until all adults were satisfied. If the adults were displeased with a child's actions, they simply left less for them. This wasn't even considered punishment, it was considered natural order. Adults ate first, adults ate most, and adults controlled when children could join. Children learned quickly that behavior impacted the chances of getting enough. The psychological pressure was immense. A medieval child knew what it meant to be hungry even on ordinary days. Food wasn't abundant, and meals weren't luxurious. The threat of less or none was terrifying. Adults didn't need to raise their voices or swing a rod. They could discipline with nothing but a withheld bowl. Hunger also reinforced moral lessons tied to religious teachings. Children were taught that gluttony was a sin, so being denied food could be framed as spiritual correction rather than punishment. Fasting could be assigned as penance, and because fasting was a respected religious act, adults could disguise discipline as piety. A child who grew too comfortable at the table might be reminded that food was a blessing, and blessings must be appreciated, preferably by nearly losing them. This didn't mean every meal denial was dramatic. Often it was calculated, controlled, and carefully applied. Medieval adults didn't want to starve children, they wanted to shape them. Punishment through hunger was temporary but memorable, harsh but survivable. Adults believed it built resilience and gratitude, two traits they considered essential for surviving the unpredictable medieval world. Children internalized this deeply. Many developed a lifelong tendency to eat quickly, quietly, and gratefully, not out of politeness, but out of fear. They learned that meals were privileges. They learned that food could disappear. They learned that obedience filled the stomach, while disobedience emptied it. And above all, they learned that medieval discipline didn't need walls or sticks or switches. It just needed a table and the power to say, "Not for you," because in medieval Europe, you weren't grounded. You were underfed. In medieval Europe, bedtime was not a cozy ritual of lullabies, soft blankets, and lovingly dimmed candles. It was a strictly controlled operation where children were expected to fall asleep quickly, quietly, and without incident. Restlessness was rebellion, noise was defiance, and nightmares, those were treated less like emotional disturbances and more like suspicious disruptions of household order. To a medieval adult, nighttime was serious business. The day was spent in exhausting labor. The night was for recovery. Anyone who disrupted that recovery, especially a child, risked the wrath of tired, overworked parents who considered uninterrupted sleep a sacred, if rare, commodity. A restless child wasn't simply annoying, they were sabotaging the family's ability to function the next day. And in medieval life, functioning was not optional. This meant that bedtime came with rules many rules, and breaking any of them could earn a child swift correction. The first rule, go to sleep when told. There was no such thing as easing into bed. Children didn't get bedtime stories or gentle coaxing. When an adult ordered them to bed, they went immediately. No stalls, no questions. No, just one more minute. Medieval children were expected to fall asleep almost on command. If they didn't, if they fidgeted, whispered, shifted, or breathed too loudly, adults assumed they were being intentionally difficult. The second rule, stay still. Medieval sleeping arrangements were cramped. Families often shared beds, sleeping pallets, or straw mattresses so thin they made the floor look luxurious. Moving around wasn't just rude, it disturbed everyone else. A child who tossed, turned, or kicked risked waking a parent, a sibling, or an exhausted older relative whose patience had long since expired. Adults believed that learning to sleep motionless was part of learning discipline. If a child couldn't control their body at night, how could they control it during the day? The third rule, no noise. Whispering was forbidden. Humming was suspicious. Talking was an immediate offense. Children were expected to lie silent as the household drifted into sleep. Any noise, whether intentional or accidental, could bring punishment. Even crying was risky. Medieval nights were quiet, and quiet was considered essential for adult rest. A child who broke the silence was treated as if they had broken a law. The fourth rule, don't disturb adults for any reason. If a child was thirsty, not an excuse. Cold? Figure it out. Scared? Deal with it silently. Had a nightmare? Absolutely. Do not wake anyone. Nighttime disruptions were treated as lack of self-control. Adults expected children to face their fears internally. Nightmares weren't interpreted as psychological distress, they were interpreted as fuel for stronger discipline the next day. A child who woke screaming didn't receive comfort. They received correction for disrupting the household. Medieval life had no room for nighttime vulnerability. Children quickly learned to internalize this. Many tried to stifle tears in the dark, curling into themselves so as not to wake siblings or parents. Fear was managed alone. Pain was endured quietly. The night taught children to be small, controlled, and invisible. The fifth rule: sleep where you're told. Medieval homes often had no designated children's bedroom. Kids slept wherever space existed on the floor, next to livestock for warmth, under a table, or beside siblings in a shared straw pile. If a child complained about discomfort, they were told to be grateful there was a place to sleep at all. And if they shifted around trying to find a better position, punishment for restlessness. Even the simple act of scratching an itch could be judged as disruptive. Bedtime discipline wasn't concerned with comfort, it was concerned with obedience. Some households implemented enforced stillness, where a child had to lie perfectly straight with hands at their sides. Any hint of movement was corrected sharply. This wasn't done out of cruelty, it was done out of the medieval belief that children needed to learn bodily discipline early. A child who mastered stillness at night was believed to better master labor, prayer, and social restraint during the day. But perhaps the most striking part of medieval bedtime discipline was how adults handled children's fears. Medieval nights were dark, truly dark. No electricity, faint moonlight, flickering candles extinguished long before sleep, and endless shadows. The medieval world was full of folklore, superstition, and whispered warnings about spirits, demons, and things that lurked in the night. Children absorbed these stories, often told to keep them obedient during the day. So when children inevitably became frightened at night, adults expected them to endure. A frightened child wasn't pitied, they were judged. Fear indicated spiritual weakness, lack of discipline, or susceptibility to nonsense. The proper response, in adult eyes, was not comfort but correction. Even nightmares were interpreted as either punishment for misbehavior or evidence of an overactive, undisciplined mind. Some children were even disciplined because they had nightmares. Adults believed fear came from guilt. If a child screamed in the night, it meant something was wrong with their conscience, and nothing motivated corrective discipline like a guilty conscience. Nighttime rules didn't end when a child finally fell asleep. Children were expected to rise instantly when called in the morning. Oversleeping wasn't tolerated. Dawn meant work, prayer, or chores, and a child who failed to wake quickly could be punished for laziness. Sleep wasn't a sanctuary, it was a monitored activity with no room for error. Through all of this, one thing remained constant. Bedtime discipline wasn't about rest. It was about control. Children weren't being taught how to sleep, they were being taught how to obey in silence, stillness, and darkness. So yes, in medieval Europe, even your dreams had rules. And if you broke them, someone would be wide awake and ready to remind you. In medieval Europe, childhood didn't protect you from labor. It qualified you for it. As soon as children were physically capable of lifting, carrying, turning, sorting, stirring, or sweeping, they were folded into the workforce of the household. And once they were working, they could be punished for working incorrectly. A medieval child didn't get in trouble for disobedience alone. They got in trouble for inefficiency, clumsiness, slowness, or simple human error. In other words, in the eyes of adults, you didn't misbehave, you miscalculated. Work was the backbone of medieval life. Every member of a household, from the smallest child to the oldest grandparent, contributed to survival. And because survival depended on constant labor, mistakes weren't just inconvenient, they were costly. If a child dropped a tool, spilled grain, scared off animals, tore cloth, mishandled fire, or damaged produce, the consequences rippled through the household. Something had to be replaced, redone, or repaired. Work was precious, and errors were expensive. Naturally, Adults treated mistakes as disciplinary issues rather than learning opportunities. A child who erred was seen as careless, inattentive, or insufficiently committed to their tasks. Adults didn't view labor as something children needed to grow into. They believed children should learn instantly, develop quickly, and execute flawlessly. So punishment came not for defiance, but for imperfection. Every type of work had its own opportunities for failure, and therefore its own form of discipline. Working with animals was a common source of trouble. Children were tasked with feeding chickens, herding geese, keeping pigs from wandering, or helping with sheep. Animals, being animals, didn't always cooperate. A goose might attack, a pig might escape, a cow might kick, a child might panic. Adults rarely blamed the animals. If livestock got loose, it was the child's fault for not anticipating the animal's behavior. Punishment followed not because the child was bad, but because livestock were assets, and assets couldn't be lost to childhood incompetence. Fieldwork was equally unforgiving. Children collecting stones, pulling weeds, carrying water, or helping with harvests were expected to work at a steady pace. Falling behind could mean being scolded, dropping vegetables meant punishment, damaging crops meant punishment, complaining meant punishment. Even taking too long to wipe sweat from their forehead could be interpreted as wasting time. Adults believed discipline on the job prevented laziness and built endurance qualities essential for adult survival. Kitchen labor had even harsher stakes. Children grinding grain, turning spits, or tending fires had to be extremely careful. A dropped pot was a disaster. A burned stew was a crisis. An uncontrolled flame could destroy the home. Mistakes in the kitchen didn't merely waste resources, they threatened safety. Hence, punishment was swift, sharp, and guaranteed to make the child remember the danger of inattentiveness. Adults didn't distinguish between accident and recklessness. Both were corrected. Craft apprenticeships operated under even stricter discipline. A child learning carpentry, weaving, tanning, metalwork, or pottery worked under a master who demanded precision. A miscut plank? Punished. A poorly spun thread? Punished. A cracked pot? Punished. Medieval workspaces did not tolerate errors because materials cost money. If a child ruined a piece of wood or leather, they weren't just making mistakes, they were costing the household or workshop valuable income. Punishment was considered compensation for the wasted effort. Children quickly learned that workplace discipline wasn't about morality, it was about efficiency. Adults didn't care what a child meant to do. They cared about the result. If the result was wrong, the lesson was delivered through consequences. Medieval thinking was simple. A child who made a mistake today would make a smaller mistake tomorrow if reminded firmly. Even simple tasks came with risks. Fetch water, don't spill. Collect eggs, don't break. Sweep the floor, don't raise dust. Help in the garden, don't pull the wrong plant. Assist in the market, don't wander off or miscount money. Every mistake was interpreted as a lack of discipline, not a learning moment. And because labour was constant, so was correction. Children often received more discipline during work hours than at any other time of day. The job provided the opportunities. Adults provided the consequences. Because medieval life was so interconnected, mistakes were never private. A child dropping something in the marketplace was corrected loudly. A child mismeasuring in a workshop could be reprimanded in front of apprentices. A child failing in the fields might be scolded where neighbouring workers could hear. Shame paired with labour discipline, creating a powerful motivator. Work silently, work correctly, or prepare for the lesson that followed. Punishments varied. Some were physical strikes across the hands, arms, or legs, to teach the body to remember. Some were task-based redoing work, repeating chores, finishing tasks alone, or being assigned heavier labour. Some were symbolic, being made to stand beside the mistake, hold the broken object, or confess the error publicly. All conveyed the same message. Accuracy was obedience, and obedience was survival. And because adults assumed children learned through repetition and fear, mistakes were rarely excused. A child was expected to learn rules from observing adults, not from trial and error. Trial and error was costly. Adults minimized the trial, by maximizing the consequences of the error. Children internalized this early. They became hyper-aware of their movements, cautious with tools, and fearful of slip-ups. Many developed the ability to anticipate adults' reactions, adjust their pace, and correct themselves before being corrected. Survival in the medieval workplace required both physical effort and emotional vigilance. The cruel irony was that children weren't misbehaving. They were learning, but medieval adults treated learning curves as character flaws. So yes, in the eyes of a medieval adult, you didn't misbehave. You miscalculated, and the world had a very efficient way of correcting bad math. If household labour was demanding for medieval children, entering an apprenticeship was the moment things became official. This was the transition from helping the family survive to becoming someone else's responsibility and problem. Contrary to modern romanticism, apprenticeships were not charming tales of young learners discovering their craft under the gentle guidance of wise artisans. They were more like long-term survival challenges overseen by adults who believed patience was a weakness and mistakes were personal insults. When a child became an apprentice, often between the ages of 7 and 12, they were handed over to a master craftsman who was now legally and socially responsible for them. The master didn't adopt the apprentice as a beloved protege. He accepted them as a long-term project, one that would require years of correction, supervision, and routine frustration. The apprentice lived with the master, ate with the master, worked with the master, and endured the master's discipline. And discipline was guaranteed. Masters believed that apprentices should be moulded, not taught. They were convinced that excellence came from obedience, repetition, and resilience, not from curiosity or creativity. An apprentice who questioned instructions risked immediate correction. An apprentice who hesitated risked harsher correction. And an apprentice who made mistakes well, that was the quickest path to discovering which objects in the workshop doubled as disciplinary tools. The logic behind this harshness was simple. Craft materials were expensive. Wood, leather, metal, cloth, dyes, everything cost money. And medieval masters were practical people. They didn't want their livelihood jeopardized by a child's clumsy hands or unfocused attention. A ruined plank wasn't just wood wasted, it was profit lost. A crooked blade wasn't a harmless accident, it was a mark of incompetence that reflected badly on the entire workshop. So when apprentices erred, masters corrected swiftly. The correction might be a strike with the flat of a tool, a sharp slap, or a stinging reminder across the knuckles, the preferred spot, since hands were the source of all mistakes. Some masters preferred verbal tirades, others favoured immediate physical reprimands. Many favoured both. The idea wasn't to punish the apprentice emotionally. The idea was to imprint the lesson into muscle memory through discomfort. Harsh correction enforced not only skill discipline but behavioural discipline. Apprentices were expected to wake before the master, work until exhaustion, and obey instantly. They swept floors, tended fires, cleaned tools, and performed menial tasks long before being trusted with anything resembling the craft they came to learn. Some apprentices spent their first year fetching water, others spent it observing silently. Many spent it doing everything except the craft itself. When apprentices did begin practicing the craft, their tasks started small: sanding, smoothing, stirring, rolling, measuring, carrying. Precision was demanded from the beginning. If a measurement was off, a cut uneven, or a line crooked, the apprentice was corrected sharply. Masters were not interested in potential, they wanted perfection, and they wanted it decades before the apprentice was capable of supplying it. In workshops where tempers ran hot, and many did apprentices, sometimes faced the brunt of the master's stress. If the workshop was behind schedule, if customers were demanding, if materials were scarce, the apprentice often absorbed the frustration. Medieval society had firm hierarchies, and masters had the authority to discipline apprentices as they saw fit, so long as they didn't cause visible injury or permanent harm. Bruises faded, lessons lingered. The emotional environment was equally strict. Apprentices weren't encouraged. They weren't complimented. Praise was rare and often silent. If a master said nothing, it meant the apprentice had done well enough not to attract criticism, which, in medieval terms, was high praise indeed. A compliment would have been so shocking it might have caused workplace injuries. But apprenticeship wasn't only about labour, it was about obedience. Masters expected unwavering respect. Apprentices couldn't speak unless spoken to. They couldn't look idle. They couldn't show frustration. They couldn't appear tired. The slightest hint of attitude or impatience was corrected instantly. A master's authority needed to be perceived as absolute, because the workshop depended on hierarchy as much as the household did. Socially, apprentices occupied the bottom rung. They were not equals to the master's family. They weren't equals to hired workers. They weren't equals to other apprentices unless they had seniority. New apprentices often took orders from older apprentices and endured additional correction just to ensure they learned their place. Hierarchy within the hierarchy. It was medieval efficiency at its finest. Discipline extended beyond the workshop. Apprentices had to behave properly in public, at market, and during guild events. A misstep outside the shop could embarrass the master and result in punishment back home. An apprentice represented the workshop's reputation. A foolish apprentice suggested a foolish master, and no craftsman would allow such a stain to go uncorrected. Even rest came with rules. Apprentices didn't choose when to stop. Masters dictated work hours, meal times, sleeping arrangements, and even leisure activities, what little leisure existed. Apprentices were expected to demonstrate gratitude, even when exhausted. Complaining was not only unacceptable, it was a punishable offence. Over time, apprentices learned to anticipate the master's expectations. They learned to watch closely, mimic silently, move quickly, and absorb instructions without asking questions. Survival depended on becoming predictable, cautious, and deferential. Skill development was intertwined with fear of wasting materials, fear of making mistakes, fear of disappointing the master, fear of earning consequences. And yet, despite the brutality, apprenticeships were highly valued. They offered a path to independence, livelihood, and respect. Surviving an apprenticeship meant emerging not only trained but tough emotionally and physically. A master who disciplined harshly was believed to produce competent craftsmen. So no, in an apprenticeship, you weren't being trained. You were being endured until you became skilled enough to be worth enduring. In medieval Europe, authority wasn't a concept, it was an ecosystem. Every person belonged to a rank, and every rank came with expectations, privileges, and power. For adults, this hierarchy was the backbone of society. For children, it was a towering ladder they were born at the bottom of, staring upward at an endless line of people, whose job, apparently, was to remind them how low they stood. If medieval children learned one truth early, it was this: everyone outranked you. And fear wasn't accidental, it was engineered. Medieval society believed that obedience was the foundation of order. Without obedience, the world fell into chaos. Crops weren't harvested, prayers weren't recited, lords weren't obeyed, and households weren't held together. Children, who were viewed as impulsive, unpredictable, and spiritually fragile, needed obedience more than anyone. And the fastest way to secure obedience was fear, cold, unforgettable, carefully administered fear. This fear wasn't limited to parents or teachers. It flowed from every adult a child encountered. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, elder siblings, neighbours, priests, masters, craftsmen, aristocrats, and even complete strangers possessed the unquestioned right to correct a child. Medieval children didn't just fear their own household authority, they feared the entire village. The reason was simple: hierarchy demanded it. A child didn't simply occupy a lower rank, they occupied the lowest possible rank. They were beneath adults, beneath older children, beneath servants, beneath apprentices, beneath strangers. A 6-year-old could be corrected by a 13-year-old. A 13-year-old could be corrected by anyone older. Even servants could discipline noble children in certain contexts. Authority wasn't based on merit, it was based on age and status. And children lacked both. This meant fear wasn't just a parenting tool, it was a cultural expectation. A medieval child walked through life under the constant possibility of reprimand. If they ran too fast, someone would yell. If they spoke too loudly, someone would correct. If they stepped somewhere they shouldn't, someone would grab their arm. Fear was the invisible shepherd, guiding them toward proper behaviour. What made this fear particularly effective was its unpredictability. A child never knew when correction might come. Maybe they'd walk past an irritable neighbour. Maybe a passing merchant disliked their posture. Maybe a priest overheard a careless remark. Medieval society gave adults permission to intervene any time a child's behaviour appeared out of line with expectations. This created a psychological environment where children policed themselves constantly. They lowered their eyes, kept their hands folded, walked carefully, spoke sparingly, and made themselves as small and unremarkable as possible. Being noticed was dangerous. Being remembered was worse. The safest child was the silent one, blending into the background, an ongoing theme of medieval childhood. But fear did more than shape behaviour. It shaped identity. Children learned that respect flowed upward, never downward. An adult didn't have to earn authority. They possessed it automatically. A child didn't have to misbehave to earn correction. They simply had to exist within reach of an adult with expectations. This ingrained belief created adults who accepted hierarchy without question, who obeyed lords and priests reflexively, who saw authority as something sacred rather than negotiated. The pressure to behave correctly around authority figures intensified depending on who those authority figures were. Priests commanded a holy fear, lords commanded a social fear, masters commanded an economic fear. Even strangers commanded a cultural fear. They represented the broader world of adulthood, and any adult could be a witness to a child's shame. Fear also played a role in children's daily routines. Entering a church, stay silent, fear of disrespecting God. Passing a noble's house, lower your eyes, fear of insulting someone above your station. Working near a master craftsman, don't breathe too loudly, fear of interrupting his concentration. Walking through a crowded marketplace, stay close, stay quiet. Stay out of the way, fear of being scolded or worse. Even the tone adults used reinforced this intimidating dynamic. Medieval adults rarely softened their voices for children. They didn't kneel, negotiate, reason, or empathize. They issued commands. They expected compliance. No child ever heard, "What do you think?" They heard, "Do this now. Don't talk. Move faster. Stand straighter." Or, "Remember your place." Hierarchical discipline also taught children to fear consequences beyond punishment. They feared disappointing elders. They feared shame. They feared being labelled troublesome. They feared losing privileges, which were few to begin with. They feared being seen as untrustworthy by the community. Most of all, they feared the ripple effect. A single moment of disobedience could become a story told by adults for months, shaping how the entire community treated them. Reputation mattered, even for children. This fear-driven upbringing created social reflexes that lasted into adulthood. Medieval adults respected authority instinctively. They obeyed lords without hesitation, deferred to priests automatically, and followed societal expectations rigidly. Fear of authority had been etched into them long before they understood why. Did a medieval child ever push back against this system? Occasionally, but rebellion usually ended quickly with consequences that reinforced the risks of trying again. Some children grew into cunning strategists, learning how to read adults' moods, predict corrections, and avoid trouble with impressive precision. Others learned to endure fear silently, working hard, staying invisible, and hoping adulthood would bring relief. For many, it did, but only because adulthood offered new authority to fear instead. In a world where hierarchy structured every breath of life, children weren't just taught obedience, they were trained in it, shaped by it, defined by it. Because medieval childhood came with one guarantee. Not only did everyone outrank you, they were prepared to prove it. Medieval Europe loved hierarchy so much that even discipline had social tiers. A noble child and a peasant child could commit the exact same mistake, drop a cup, speak out of turn, question an instruction, and both would face consequences. But how they faced them depended on where they lived, what they wore, and how many people bowed when their family walked by. Discipline wasn't a universal experience. It was a class-specific performance. In lower-class homes where survival hung by a thread, and threads frayed quickly, discipline was raw, immediate, and intimately tied to practical necessity. Peasant children lived in crowded cottages filled with tools, livestock, fire hazards, and constant labour. One careless mistake could ruin food stores, damage equipment, or let animals escape. Punishment reflected those stakes. A peasant child might be scolded loudly, corrected with work-based consequences, or physically disciplined with whatever tool happened to be closest. Discipline was a response to survival-level pressures. But noble children? Their mistakes rarely threatened survival. They threatened reputation, and that difference shaped everything. Noble discipline wasn't kinder, it was simply more theatrical. Instead of punishing for practical failures, noble children were punished for social ones. Poor posture, sloppy manners, speaking at the wrong moment, looking unimpressed during ceremonies, forgetting honorifics, or failing to display the elegance expected of their rank. A peasant child could drop a bowl and be punished because food was precious. A noble child could drop a bowl and be punished because it made the household look uncultured in front of servants. In both cases, the child felt the sting just for very different reasons. Peasant households followed a no-nonsense discipline system rooted in the urgency of labour. Children were corrected in the fields, near the hearth, or during chores. Punishment was direct. A hit to the hands, an extra load of work, or a humiliating scolding in front of the family. Adults expected children to mature quickly because the household needed their labour. Peasant discipline focused on reliability, endurance, and practicality. The worst thing a peasant child could be was useless. Meanwhile, noble discipline took place in grand halls, solar chambers, and well-furnished nurseries. But don't be fooled by the velvet cushions. Noble childhood was heavy with rules. Noble children were expected to maintain rigid etiquette from an early age. They learned how to bow, how to sit, how to walk, how to serve wine without spilling, and how to remain calm during formal gatherings filled with adults judging every move. Where peasant children learned to milk goats and sweep floors, noble children learned to recite poetry, dance gracefully, and behave like miniature courtiers. Failure wasn't dangerous, it was embarrassing. And embarrassment was its own form of social catastrophe. Because noble households were full of servants, tutors, governesses, and attendants, there was always an adult present to enforce discipline. A noble child rarely escaped supervision. Every glance was judged. Every slip-up was noted. Noble discipline was constant surveillance dressed in fine fabrics. Punishments differed as well. Peasant discipline relied on speed and whatever instrument lay nearby. Noble discipline relied on symbolism, controlled environments, and endless corrections. A noble child might be sent to kneel on cold stone as a sign of penitence, confined to their chambers without games or companions, made to copy verses repeatedly as mental punishment, denied participation in feasts, hunts, or dances, publicly corrected by tutors for improper speech or posture. The discipline was humiliating, but not messy. Noble punishment preferred dignity over spectacle. The child needed correction, not bruises visible in public. That said, noble children were not immune to physical discipline. Many tutors used rods, switches, or striking tools, but punishment was designed to avoid marring the child's appearance. A noble child with visible welts would reflect badly on the family. Discipline needed to leave an impression without leaving a mark. So, masters aimed for the hands, legs, or places hidden by clothing. The goal was the same: obedience through discomfort, just executed with more tact, an expensive flooring beneath the child. Class also shaped who delivered discipline. Peasant children were disciplined by parents, older siblings, neighbours, or anyone within scolding distance. Noble children were disciplined by a curated hierarchy of adults whose job descriptions included deliver disappointment professionally. A noble parent might not discipline their own child directly. They might delegate the task to a tutor or governess. This created an odd emotional distance. Peasant children feared their parents. Noble children feared their tutors. Either way, someone was always ready to correct them. Expectations differed too. Peasant children were expected to toughen up physically. Noble children were expected to toughen up socially. A peasant child who cried during work risked being seen as weak. A noble child who cried during court training risked being seen as embarrassing. In both worlds, crying led to correction, but for wildly different reasons. And yet, beneath the surface, Both forms of discipline served the same cultural purpose: to prepare children for the roles medieval society expected them to fill. Peasant children needed to become durable labourers. Noble children needed to become polished adults capable of navigating complex etiquette, alliances, and political expectations. Discipline shaped them accordingly. But whether you slept on straw or silk, the medieval world had a way of making sure lessons stuck. Sometimes the rod was rough. Sometimes the rod was polished. But the message never changed. The pain was the same. The furniture was just nicer. If medieval discipline was harsh for boys, it was even harsher for girls. Not because they were expected to do more, but because they were expected to be less visible, less vocal, less assertive, less anything that suggested individuality, independence, or opinions. A medieval girl's behaviour wasn't just a reflection of herself, it was a reflection of her entire family's honour, morality, and social standing. So girls received a specific, relentless kind of discipline designed to mould them into the one shape medieval society found acceptable: quiet, modest, obedient, and ideally invisible. From the moment a girl could walk, she was coached into silence. Talking loudly, laughing freely, or expressing opinions too boldly were treated as early signs of moral disorder. Adults believed a girl's voice was something dangerous if left uncontained, so it was corrected at the first opportunity. A girl who spoke out of turn might be shushed, scolded, or punished for immodesty. A girl who interrupted an adult conversation could expect a sharper correction, and a girl who dared argue. That was the medieval equivalent of social treason. Girls learned quickly that their safest state was quiet observance. Good girls didn't cause attention. Great girls avoided being noticed at all. Modesty was the centerpiece of female discipline. Modesty in speech. Modesty in posture. Modesty in movement. Modesty in clothing. Modesty wasn't simply a virtue, it was a shield meant to protect a girl's reputation from gossip, judgment, or suspicion. Medieval society constantly scrutinized girls for signs of moral weakness, and the idea that a girl could invite trouble through behavior was deeply ingrained. Females were viewed as spiritually vulnerable, easily influenced, and prone to temptation, or worse, capable of tempting others simply by existing incorrectly. Because reputation mattered so much, girls were disciplined for behaviors boys might get away with. If a girl laughed too loudly, adults reprimanded her. If she ran through the village rather than walking demurely, punishment followed. If she made eye contact with the wrong adult at the wrong moment, that too could be a problem. Girls weren't supposed to look curious. They weren't supposed to look confident. They weren't supposed to look like they noticed the world around them too directly. That kind of awareness suggested opinions. Opinions suggested independence, and independence suggested danger. Even household tasks came with gendered discipline. Girls were taught to sew, spin, weave, cook, and clean with careful precision. Mistakes weren't framed as simple accidents. They were framed as evidence of future incompetence as wives or mothers. A crooked stitch wasn't just a crooked stitch, it was a sign she might one day shame her household with poorly made clothing. A burned pot wasn't just a burned pot, it was a warning that she might fail her future family. Women's work was treated as destiny, and discipline ensured girls understood that destiny from the start. And because girls were trained to serve others, discipline often revolved around service expectations. A girl who didn't fetch water quickly enough could be punished. A girl who didn't anticipate her parents' needs might be scolded for inattentiveness. A girl who showed displeasure rolling her eyes, sighing, hesitating could be accused of disrespect. Adults viewed emotional expression in girls as a dangerous breach of modesty. Silence, obedience, and pleasant submission were not just encouraged, they were enforced. Religion added another layer. Medieval sermons emphasized female purity, humility, and subservience. Girls were told that obedience pleased God, while willfulness displeased him. Every adult, from mothers to priests, reinforced the idea that a girl's greatest virtues were restraint and invisibility. She was to be pious without pride, diligent without recognition, helpful without pause, and cheerful without expressing too much joy, because joy could look suspiciously like confidence. Where boys were corrected publicly for defiance, girls were corrected privately for perception. A girl didn't need to say something wrong, she only needed to appear too bold, too comfortable, or too noticed. Discipline often took the form of verbal shame. A proper girl wouldn't do that. Social restriction, being confined indoors after misbehaving. Work penalties, extra chores to reinforce diligence. Physical correction, though usually delivered in a way that didn't leave visible marks. Moral lectures about modesty, purity, and reputation. Girls were trained to internalize their discipline, to self-correct, self-silence, and self-blame. Adults expected them to anticipate disapproval without needing explicit instruction. A girl who needed to be told twice was considered troublesome. Even play was regulated. Girls weren't supposed to run freely, climb trees, or engage in messy outdoor games. Instead, they practiced domestic tasks or quiet amusements. Energetic behavior was labeled wild or unladylike, and adults quashed it early. A girl who displayed too much spirit was at risk, not physically, but socially. Adults believed the world judged girls harshly, so they disciplined girls harshly to prepare them. Class didn't erase this pattern, it intensified it. Peasant girls were taught obedience to ensure labor reliability and protect family reputation within the village. Noble girls were taught obedience as preparation for marriage alliances, court behavior, and political expectations. A noble girl's misbehaviors could ruin negotiations or insult a visiting lord. A peasant girl's missteps could fuel gossip that damaged family honor. In both worlds, girls learned quickly that their bodies, voices, and choices were watched constantly. And so, medieval girlhood became a training ground for adult submission. The goal wasn't to help girls grow, it was to help girls disappear into the roles expected of them. Good girls were quiet. Great girls were invisible. And the medieval world made sure they learned that lesson long before they understood why. If medieval girls were disciplined into silence, medieval boys were disciplined into stone. A boy's upbringing was an apprenticeship in toughness, long before he held a tool, a weapon, or a position in society. He had to prove he could hold himself together. Medieval Europe believed manhood required endurance, aggression, emotional suppression, and physical resilience. Boys weren't raised, they were forged. And nothing forged a boy faster than pain. From the moment a boy could toddle across a dirt floor, adults began preparing him for the hardness of adult life. Medieval manhood was not gentle. Men labored, fought, endured hardship, protected households, and upheld honor. Adults believed softness in a boy predicted disaster in a man. So they stamped it out early, ruthlessly, and repetitively. For boys, discipline wasn't just about correcting misbehavior. It was about shaping identity. A boy who cried too easily? Corrected. A boy who hesitated? Corrected. A boy who showed fear? Corrected immediately, and often publicly, to prevent the terrible fate of becoming weak. Weakness was the medieval masculine equivalent of sin, and adults hunted for it constantly. Crying was treated as the enemy, not because adults didn't understand fear or pain, but because they believed boys had to grow out of expressing it. When a boy cried, adults reacted swiftly, with scolding, with punishment, or with humiliation meant to toughen him up. Crying didn't earn comfort, it earned consequences. Medieval parents, tutors, and even male relatives reinforced the idea that tears were a moral failure. A boy didn't stop crying because he felt better, he stopped because he learned what happened if he didn't. Pain was not avoided in a boy's upbringing, it was deployed strategically. Boys were expected to endure harsh punishments with minimal sound. A boy who yelped during discipline might be disciplined again for reacting. Adults claimed this built character. They believed a man's future required a high pain tolerance after all. Battlefields, ploughfields, and workshop benches were not known for comfort. Where girls were warned about modesty, boys were warned about cowardice. That fear shaped everything. The way boys walked, worked, interacted, and even played. Boys' games were physical racing, mock fighting, wrestling, climbing, throwing, chasing animals, and roughhousing. Adults encouraged these activities not because they cared about fun, but because they believed bruises strengthened the body and humiliation strengthened the spirit. If a boy shied away from rough games, adults intervened. Boys who were too timid were pushed into participation. Being excluded wasn't mercy, it was a mark of shame. Other boys would tease, taunt, or gang up on anyone who seemed too gentle. Medieval childhood didn't have bullies. It had training methods. Masculinity was enforced in every environment. At home, boys were expected to lift heavier objects, take on riskier chores, and be physically useful. In fields, they were pushed harder and scolded faster than sisters. In workshops, they were expected to handle tools with steadiness far beyond their years. In villages, they were expected to stand tall, speak minimally, and behave like small men. A boy who flinched when handling livestock or tools risked punishment. A boy who hesitated near the forge was lectured. A boy who approached dangerous tasks too cautiously was mocked or corrected. Medieval adulthood demanded confidence, and adults believed confidence grew best when planted in discomfort. Perhaps the most defining feature of male discipline was the expectation of physical bravery. Boys were encouraged to touch animals, other children feared grab the goat, secure the goose, drive the pigs, climb the unstable ladder, cross the slippery stones. The medieval world was full of hazards, and boys were expected to confront them without hesitation. If they fell, they were told to stand. If they got hurt, they were told it wouldn't be the last time. Fear wasn't seen as normal. It was seen as a threat to future competence. Adults used shame generously to erase it. Not because they were cruel, but because they genuinely believed a fearful boy risked becoming a useless adult. Boys were often scolded with phrases like, "Stand like a man," "Don't shame yourself," "Pain teaches strength," "Tears won't help you harvest." Masculine identity was shaped not in adolescence, but in childhood. Medieval men didn't wake up at 18 and discover they needed to be tough. They had been trained to be tough since infancy. And this training wasn't only physical. Emotional discipline was relentless. Boys weren't comforted after frightening dreams. They weren't soothed after painful injuries. They weren't encouraged to express anxieties. They weren't asked how they felt, because feeling wasn't part of the job description. A medieval boy learned early that emotional vulnerability was punished, not supported. If he struggled with grief, sadness, or anger, he was told to suppress it. If he admitted he was frightened, he was reminded that men protected others, not the other way around. Emotional literacy had no place in medieval masculinity. Stoicism was the goal, and these expectations grew even harsher depending on class. A noble boy was groomed for command, combat training, and political maneuvering silencing fear was part of preparing him to lead. A peasant boy was groomed for physical endurance, back-breaking labor, and constant risk silencing weakness was part of ensuring survival. Different futures, same pressure. Over time, boys internalized discipline so fully that they became self-correcting. They stopped crying before tears could form. They ignored injuries until work was finished. They forced themselves into dangers they didn't understand because adults expected bravery, not caution. The cycle of male discipline didn't end with punishment. It continued in the boy's own mind, long after the adult walked away. And that was the point. Medieval society didn't want obedient boys. It wanted unbreakable men. Men who endured pain silently. Men who stood firm in danger. Men who carried burdens without complaint. Men who forgot how to cry long before anyone taught them how to speak freely. So in medieval Europe, crying wasn't weakness. It was corrected until boys forgot it was ever an option. To modern eyes, medieval discipline looks brutal sometimes, shockingly so. But to medieval adults, it wasn't cruelty. It was insurance. A child's life was uncertain, fragile, and often heartbreakingly brief. Survival required toughness, obedience, endurance, and the ability to withstand fear, hardship, and pain. In a world where danger lived everywhere outside the home, inside the home, in the fields, in the churchyard, in the river, in the winter wind, discipline wasn't punishment. It was training. And the first lesson medieval parents taught was this: childhood is short, life is shorter. A medieval child grew up surrounded by reminders of mortality. Graves were fresh, funerals were frequent, and sickness moved through villages without warning. Parents had likely buried infants, siblings, or cousins long before their surviving children could walk. Children themselves understood death early, not through stories, but through experience. They saw it. They smelled it. They lived next to it. This constant closeness to mortality shaped how adults viewed childhood. A soft child, a child who hesitated, cried easily, defied instructions, or lacked discipline wasn't just inconvenient. They were at risk. Adults believed discipline hardened children against the world's dangers. If a child learned to stay silent, they wouldn't accidentally provoke someone dangerous. If a child learned to obey instantly, they wouldn't wander into a hazardous place. If a child learned to endure pain, they wouldn't crumble when life demanded sacrifice. If a child learned fear of consequences, they would make fewer mistakes, mistakes that, in medieval life, could be deadly. It wasn't that parents didn't care. It was that care looked different when survival was always on a knife's edge. A child who failed to learn caution could drown in a river, fall into a fire, eat something poisonous, or be trampled by livestock. A child who didn't understand risk could be injured by tools, carts, or construction. A child who ignored instructions in a field could ruin crops essential for winter survival. A child who defied an authority figure could anger someone with the power to retaliate. Medieval danger wasn't cinematic. It was everyday, invisible, and unforgiving. So discipline served as a shield, a painful, relentless shield. Take harsh verbal correction. Adults barked instructions not to intimidate, but to keep children alert and reactive. A child who listened quickly survived more often than one who needed gentle persuasion. Take physical punishment. A painful mistake was considered a small price compared to a fatal one. If a quick slap taught a child never to touch the hearth poker again, it was a victory. Take strict expectations of silence. Quiet children avoided drawing unwanted attention from neighbors, from strangers, from volatile adults, from anyone capable of harm. Take the early demands of labor. Medieval life did not wait for childhood to pass. Skills learned early meant contributions gained early and less chance of starvation later. Adults weren't preparing children for a comfortable adulthood. They were preparing them for a harsh adolescence and an uncertain future. Many children began working by age 5. Many were expected to help manage siblings, animals, tools, or tasks long before they understood the dangers involved. Discipline wasn't meant to be kind. It was meant to be effective. This mindset also explains why medieval parents were far less emotionally indulgent. Comfort was scarce. Resources were few. Time was limited. Parents didn't soothe nightmares because they needed children to sleep, not talk. They didn't comfort crying because crying didn't help the work get done. They didn't validate fears because the world didn't validate anyone's fears. If anything, parents feared that too much comfort would weaken a child, making them unfit for the world waiting beyond childhood's brief window. Discipline was also shaped by the medieval belief in fate and divine will. Many parents saw themselves as responsible for preparing their children morally and spiritually. If a child grew up undisciplined, they risked spiritual ruin, something medieval adults feared more than physical hardship. A harsh upbringing wasn't simply preparation for earthly dangers. It was preparation for heavenly judgment. A disciplined child was a safer child in both worlds. This survival mindset created an upbringing in which independence was forced early. Children were expected to make adult decisions before they understood consequence, to work before they understood fatigue, to obey before they understood danger, to endure before they understood compassion. But within this severity, something complex existed. Medieval adults genuinely believed discipline equaled protection. They were convinced hardship built resilience. They believed children needed to be shaped early before the world shaped them cruelly later. And the world, in their eyes, was cruel by default. Death, hunger, war, famine, cold, disease, these were not abstract threats. They were weekly realities. A parent who softened their child risked their child's life. Better to harden them early than lose them later. So yes, medieval childhood was harsh. But to medieval adults, discipline wasn't heartlessness. It was hope. A hope that the child would survive long enough to become someone who could survive on their own. The world was cruel. Parents were just getting you ready. Because in medieval Europe, a gentle childhood wasn't a blessing. It was a liability. To modern ears, medieval discipline sounds like a horror anthology written by someone who hated children. But medieval adults weren't trying to traumatize the young, they were trying to protect them. They believed discipline was love, not the gentle, supportive kind we recognize today, but a fierce, survival-driven, spiritually loaded form of love, shaped by a world that rewarded softness with death and punished mistakes with consequences far worse than tears. To understand medieval parenting, you must understand medieval reality. Life was unforgiving, unpredictable, and short. Love had to be practical. Love had to be strict. Love had to prepare children for the brutalities ahead. And so medieval parents expressed love in the only language their world valued discipline. Medieval adults saw fear as a protective force. Fear kept a child from wandering near rivers, wells, fire pits, or livestock pens. Fear kept a child from angering a lord, a priest, or a stranger. Fear kept a child alert in fields, markets, and forests filled with hazards. Fear kept a child quiet in places where quietness could save their life. Fear, in a sense, was their version of a safety belt, painfully applied, but intended to keep a child alive. Medieval adults believed that a child without fear was a child in danger. They didn't have the luxury of imagining a world where children explored freely without consequence. Their world punished exploration. It punished curiosity. It punished hesitation. It punished mistakes. So they taught children, sometimes brutally, to avoid all of those things. The cultural logic was simple. A disciplined child was a safer child. A safer child was a living child. A living child was proof that a parent had done their duty. And parental duty was sacred. Medieval adults did not raise children alone. Society constantly reinforced the belief that discipline was the correct expression of love. Sermons praised strict parents. Community gossip shamed lenient households. Moral writings emphasized the dangers of indulgence. Even popular sayings linked parental love with discipline, equating affection with danger and strictness with virtue. A child spoiled with comfort was believed to grow into a disobedient adult, vulnerable to temptation, laziness, and social ruin. A child shaped through discipline became a pillar of the community, obedient, hard-working, pious, and humble. Medieval parents weren't trying to hurt their children. They were trying to produce the kind of adults their world required. This cultural logic extended into every part of childhood. Physical punishment wasn't viewed as violence, it was framed as responsible correction. Parents believed the body learned faster when it hurt. Pain wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. Adults saw suffering as a tool to teach important lessons before the world taught them in harsher ways. Silence and obedience weren't meant to suppress a child's personality, they were meant to protect the household's stability. A child who knew their place ensured social order. A child who obeyed instantly kept the peace. A child who didn't talk back avoided conflicts with adults who might retaliate. Harsh labor expectations weren't exploitation, they were preparation. A child who worked from a young age learned skills necessary for survival. A child who contributed to the household made the family stronger. A child who understood effort early became an efficient adult. Gender discipline wasn't random, it followed the medieval understanding of societal roles. Girls were shaped into future wives, mothers, and managers of households. Boys were shaped into future laborers, soldiers, craftsmen, and protectors. Discipline ensured they didn't deviate from destinies considered essential to communal stability. In every case, adults believed they were acting responsibly, even lovingly. The emotional distance that modern readers might interpret as coldness was, in medieval eyes, a gift. Expressing too much affection was believed to weaken a child. Comfort could make them fragile. Reassurance could make them reckless. Medieval adults feared that if children were sheltered emotionally, life would strike them harder later. To them, tenderness endangered survival. Toughness preserved it. Many parents also assumed children didn't feel emotions as deeply as adults. They believed children were resilient, forgetful, and naturally inclined to bounce back from discipline. We know today this isn't true, but medieval psychology had no such knowledge. Adults could discipline harshly while genuinely believing their child wasn't emotionally harmed. Religion amplified everything. Medieval Christianity emphasized humility, obedience, self-denial, and fear of God. Children were believed to be born sinful, impulsive, and morally unformed. Discipline wasn't just parental responsibility, it was spiritual duty. A parent who corrected their child's behavior was protecting their soul. A child's tears were interpreted as resistance to moral shaping, not evidence of distress. So when medieval adults punished, shamed, silenced, or pushed children to endure, they believed they were acting out of care. Deep, committed, sacrificial care. This doesn't excuse the suffering children experienced, but it explains the worldview that shaped it. To the medieval parent, love wasn't comfort. Love wasn't softness. Love wasn't emotional warmth. Love was discipline. Love was correction. Love was molding children into adults capable of surviving a world that took the unprepared without warning. The tragic irony? Those children grew into adults who believed fear was the foundation of responsible parenting. They raised their own children with the same strictness, convinced it was kindness, and the cycle continued for centuries. So yes, the good news? You survived medieval childhood. The bad news? You now think fear is parenting. And in the medieval world, that meant the adults believed they'd done their job well.